Chapter 461. Mobilization. In Wuxing City, Ozania was inspecting the factory construction accompanied by Patel. "Prime Minister, please look," Patel said, pointing to the workers operating machinery and the engineers directing them nearby. "This factory used to produce electrical appliances, and as per instructions, it is anticipated to be quickly converted for the production of electrical components for the Lion tank." After a pause, Patel continued, "There are many similar conversions taking place, and we estimate that we can complete the first phase of the civilian to military engineering within a month's time." Ozania nodded. The pace was roughly within her expectations. However, Patel next to her still hesitated. After some thought, he asked, "Converting so many factories from civilian to military use, isn't that a bit of an overreaction? It's not so bad here since most are already basic heavy industry and military industry. But I've heard that the changes in Revival City are significant. Many consumer and civilian factories have shifted to military production. Especially those that make agricultural and construction machinery, the reduction in their output is significant. I'm genuinely worried that this might slow down the union's development." Ozania's expression remained unchanged. She reassured him, "Just carry out the orders with peace of mind, these are the commands of the Governor-General. Besides, there's no need to worry too much. The shift in production capacity from civilian to military isn't happening all at once. The government and the military have consulted and set up multiple levels of mobilization orders, which include plans for the conversion of civilian factories for military use. These are activated step by step, and not all at once. War is still the first priority, we must ensure we survive first." "But, isn't Blackbird Heavy Industries located thousands of miles away? They haven't posed any threat to the Union for a long time. Do we really need to take action against them now? The Union's various constructions are flourishing, we're on a rising trajectory, so why interrupt it like this?" Ozania turned around to face Patel. Patel met the gaze of the Prime Minister with openness. He asked himself, filled with loyalty and committed to the public good, without any personal agenda, what was there to fear? Ozania sighed inwardly. These concerns were probably not just Patel's own but reflected those of the entire Union. The residents of the Union, at least the majority of them, held great affection for the Union and the Governor-General. The Governor-General never lied about promises. Once included in the Union's system and assigned a rank, residents would receive corresponding treatment, there would be no more living in constant uncertainty. Just this assurance alone was enough to ensure that the vast majority of civilians, who had moved from chaos to peace, were wholeheartedly loyal to the Union and to the Governor-General. Not to mention, in the Union's ranking system, which has been operating for a year or two and seemed quite dynamic, there were sizable opportunities for mobility between different social strata. Even though the Union wasn't a utopia and also needed to generate revenue and development and inevitably encountered corruption within its system, life was still far better than in the past. Under these circumstances, a few troublemakers couldn't stir up much trouble. Yet, those who opposed taking action against Blackbird Heavy Industries were not necessarily just those harboring resentment. The general public, who supported the Governor-General and felt a sense of belonging to the Union, were diligently building their homes, looking forward to a brighter future, and watching that future gradually become a reality within reach. In such a context, why suddenly go to war? Especially initiating it? Of course, Ozania knew the reasons. It could have been ignored before, but now that it was known that Blackbird Heavy Industries had violated the Smart Mechanisms embargo, they naturally had to be dealt with. The crisis posed by smart mechanisms couldn't be allowed to continue. While it may seem harmless now, with Blackbird Heavy Industries keeping to themselves out west, if left unchecked, when they finally decided to make a move, the scale could potentially grow beyond what the Union could handle. Although it was difficult to speak directly to this reason, it wasn't without alternative methods of circumvention. In substance, Blackbird Heavy Industries posed a real threat to the Union. Leaving aside the sensitive information regarding smart mechanisms, which wasn't ideal to disclose publicly, simple propaganda about the just cause of the war and portraying Blackbird Heavy Industries as a grave threat to the beautiful lives of millions in the Union, as a harbinger of disaster, would suffice. In fact, related foreign propaganda efforts were already underway when the decision was made. But looking at it now, it seemed the efforts weren't sufficient, as even a high-ranking official like Patel wasn't convinced. While verbally reassuring Patel and encouraging him to focus on his duties, Ozania also made a mental note. Upon returning, she needed to summon the people from the propaganda department, urge them to work more effectively, and even discipline some of those responsible for managing these efforts. Wuxing City was only the first stop on Ozania's inspection tour. Then, she boarded the Wind Falcon and toured several other industrial bases in the vicinity. Other areas in the Central Province, the Central North Province, the Jeoda Province, everywhere the civilian to military work was proceeding in an orderly fashion. The scale wasn't very large, but this was a dress rehearsal. The time for full mobilization of war potential hadn't come yet, just as Patel had said. As the Union's Prime Minister, Ozania did not wish to disrupt the Union's current booming development trend too much because of a war. Chapter 462. However, the Alliance must possess this capability for mobilization. Currently under a Level 2 mobilization order, it should not significantly impact residents' lives, corresponding welfare and allowances will not be cut. The consumer goods market and the food industry market will be affected to some extent, but not severely, with a lesser variety available. Yet, moving to the next tier with a Level 1 mobilization order, maintaining an unaffected state would become challenging. At that point, there would likely be a significant drafting of troops, a wartime economy would be initiated, cutting welfare and allowances, and civilian factories would be further converted into military ones. With a total mobilization order, it would be as if the entire alliance was deploying all its strength in response to war. All population, all production and living, would revolve around the war. Most able-bodied men and even a considerable number of women would be conscripted into the military, the remaining populace, from the elderly to the youngest, would be engaged in war-related work, as producing even one more bullet was beneficial, all non-war-related consumption would be minimized. Since the establishment of the alliance, such a level of total mobilization has never been initiated. But Ozania was confident that the system she had built, in line with Governor-General's overall expectations, was capable of reaching that degree and unleashing immense wartime potential. This was her pride and joy, but she would prefer it to never be necessary. She was well aware that if the alliance mobilized to that extent, the damage to economic development would be tremendous. Anxiously returning to Revival City, she went to report to Mr. Gu. Arriving at the conference room door, she was right on schedule. The alliance values practical matters, without fussing over the superfluous. Even when meeting with Mr. Gu, there's no need for an appointment during slow times. During busy periods, meetings are scheduled to avoid long waits and there's no need to arrive early. Ozania arrived on the dot, only to learn that Mr. Gu was with Generals Yan Fangxiu and Tadeus. Their appointment was before hers, and by rights, they should have finished by now, but perhaps due to some unexpected issues, or some topics not thoroughly discussed, they had been delayed. She waited outside patiently, only to hear a voice echo in her mind. "Come in, listen along, and share your thoughts." That was the voice of Mr. Gu. Ozania quickly gathered her wits and proceeded forward. The guards outside did not stop her, apparently also having been informed. Once inside, two men were engaged in a debate about something. Mr. Gu sat at the head of the table, not participating in the discussion, but listening intently. Ozania didn't rush to speak either. She casually found a seat and listened attentively. After a while, she roughly understood what was going on. The alliance's overall mobilization was in preparation for war, and naturally, it was the military's job to fight. At present, the Rage Bear Legion, soon to receive an official designation from the Star Realm Army, had been deployed. A 14,000-strong force moved from its original base in the Central Province, traversing 500 kilometers west to the Western Desert. Joining them was the Central Group Army. Of course, this Central Group Army was no longer the same one that fought in the three provinces in the east. The original Central Group Army was divided into three sections. One part established the Hagian Star Group Army to maintain the colonies, another was integrated into the Rage Bear Legion. Only the 1st Brigade remained, augmented by the newly established 46th to 50th Divisions, forming the new Central Group Army. Recently, the newly formed 39th and 40th Reserve Divisions of the former Eastern Group Army, along with the 21st to 25th Reserve Divisions from the Green Valley Group Army, were also incorporated into it. As a result, the current Central Group Army also consisted of 13 divisions, totaling 100,000 troops. Combining these two corps equaled 250,000 troops. This represented the Alliance's main maneuverable force, available without initiating further mobilization and without affecting the defense of each region itself. Meanwhile, the new recruit camps across the Alliance had recruited around 100,000 people in total. They were in training and would supplement the frontline troops in accordance with the progress and needs of the war, ensuring that the two Western armies would always have ample personnel. These new recruits were the result of the mobilization order, which Ozania was aware of. Although conscription wasn't under her jurisdiction and belonged to Thaddeus's military administration's draft office, it still required close cooperation with local governments. Under the second-level mobilization order, the number of reserve forces would continue to increase. It was estimated that the military personnel pool could reach 5% of the total population, which meant about 1.25 million people. Aside from the more than 400,000 already in service and the 100,000 in new recruit camps, there was still recruitment space for approximately 700,000 more. If that wasn't enough, it might be necessary to issue a first-level mobilization order, which would raise the total number of people mobilized to 10%. And if that was still insufficient, reaching the point of an alliance-wide mobilization order, the ceiling could go up to 20% of the population, but that would be quite exaggerated. The strategic goal of the 250,000-strong legion gathering in the west during the first phase was the West Desert region. It wasn't about occupying the entire vast western desert, for that was too large. Scattering 200,000 people across it would be like sprinkling water on a desert, meaningless. The main objective was still to control the oasis in the eastern part of the West Desert region that already had more contact with the Alliance and, especially, to secure control of the main thoroughfare that ran across the western desert straight to the western continent. This main thoroughfare was likely a remnant from the pre-war era, originally a solidly paved road. However, due to environmental changes, warfare, and the collapse of the unified government, this thoroughfare was in particularly poor condition without maintenance. It was barely passable thanks to the self-maintenance efforts of itinerant traders and the oases along the way. Most crucially, there was nowhere else to go if not through here. All sorts of heavy equipment and vehicles, although possessing excellent off-road capabilities, crossing 10,000 kilometers of wilderness to embark on an expedition to the west, would still be too much. This barely usable highway not only needed to be occupied but also required engineer troops to further repair and maintain it. At the moment, the troops were not far from the western desert. The point of contention between Yan Fangxiu, the major general commander, and Thaddeus, the military governor, was how to deal with the many oasis powers in the western desert. There was no unified government in the western desert. Each oasis and the plantation factories beneath them were like independent city-states, with their own political systems and armed forces. Coming from a military perspective, Yan Fangxiu did not wish to conquer through sheer force alone as this would heavily burden his troops, making it difficult to complete the task of pushing the front to the central region of the western desert and establishing the main defense line within a month and a half. His troops would spend a lot of time and effort suppressing resisting forces. He would rather see diplomatic measures employed as long as the oases on the eastern side caused no trouble. Thaddeus, on the other hand, was concerned about the uncertainties regarding the plantation factories beneath those oases. A lengthy supply line with too many third-party forces possessing their own military might along the way was extremely dangerous. Both had valid points. Of course, their disagreement wasn't particularly fierce, as no one was a fool. Both understood that the other's concerns were justified, and they were constantly discussing possible solutions. They discussed a range of topics, from the intensity of diplomatic measures to how to deal with local armed forces, which strategic points along the way definitely needed to be secured for safety, which could be left for later, and how to arrange troop defenses and suppression. Audinia listened and noted many things. She also came to understand why Mr. Gu had wanted her to listen in. The Alliance Foreign Affairs Department was a relatively independent institution outside of the government, and it had not been given much attention. There hadn't been much need for diplomacy until now. Conversely, the Alliance Commerce Department under Audinia had more capacity to play a role in this area. She slowly joined the discussion, mainly contributing to discourse about the political attitudes of the oases and their relationship with the Alliance, as well as potential starting points for engagement. During the discussion, a plan gradually took shape. Throughout the process, Gu Hang seldom spoke, only making decisive judgments when matters were left unresolved. This was precisely the situation that Gu Hang desired. Chapter 463. The Alliance isn't Gu Hang's alone. He can't make all the decisions himself, or he'd be overwhelmed to death. Right now, the gathering of opinions and gradually forming strategies are exactly what he wanted to see. These people were all talented and capable individuals. Through the system's function, Gu Hang had selected them and, with the hero template, accelerated their growth, aiming for the effect he was seeing now. The three of them had discussed and come to a conclusion which Gu Hang reviewed and found no issues with, so it was time to execute it. After sending the three away to their respective tasks, Gu Hang found himself alone in his office, deep in thought. Honestly, after receiving the intelligence from Blackbird City, he didn't want to start a major conflict right away. Just being well prepared was enough. Activating a level 2 mobilization was just a precaution. The best case scenario would be to maintain the status quo. If Blackbird Heavy Industries remained quiet, so much the better, Gu Heng wouldn't go looking for trouble. All he needed to do was wait peacefully for his mother to maneuver politically within the Star Sector and for the arrival of the Star Realm Army. That would be the best time to deal a fatal blow to Blackbird Heavy Industries. For this reason, Gu Heng even refrained from using orbital bombardment to avoid an excessive reaction from Blackbird. But evidently, Blackbird didn't plan on giving him that chance anymore. The commotion caused by more than 10 demon hunters in Blackbird City wasn't small. Certainly, it had provided Gu Heng with important intelligence, but clearly, Blackbird Heavy Industries was now aware that their cover had been blown. Blackbird, taking the initiative, had already begun mobilizing. This intelligence came from the continent's west. The Alliance had dispatched a new Demon Hunter squad and over 200 Special Service Intelligence operatives to the Western Desert. It was difficult to infiltrate Blackbird City, attempting it was a near-suicidal mission, especially after the disturbance caused by Island Bird and others, which would surely have resulted in increased security. However, it was less risky to set up intelligence posts in the outlying settlements across those thousands of square kilometers of land in the Western Desert outside of Blackbird City. And it was precisely these intelligence posts that noticed the unusual mobilization of personnel and deployment of forces by Blackbird Heavy Industries. They observed the large-scale congregation and movement of materials within the areas controlled by Blackbird Heavy Industries. They saw the movement of personnel. And if those were just preliminary warnings, even more alarming was the movement of military forces they witnessed. Drones as small as a palm to ones as large as a car, mechanical dogs equipped with 360-degree rotatable light armament platforms, countless modified humans forming combat troops, numerous Challenger tanks. All of these could be seen without even needing to enter Blackbird City, visible from the outside. Related intelligence was urgently sent back, one report after another. If Blackbird was on the move, how could the Alliance stay still? The instruction Gu Heng issued was to repel the enemy from beyond their borders. If the war couldn't be delayed, then it was to be fought, but it couldn't take place on Alliance soil. It was unacceptable if the flames of war reached the central province, especially near Revival City and Wuxing of the Twin Cities. The West Desert region was an excellent choice for a pre-designated battlefield. It was sparsely populated with vast expanses of desert, and most of the valuable oases relied on underground plantations, which made the area suitable for combat without fearing damage to the land. It was precisely because of sensing Blackbird's movements that the Alliance hastily decided to mobilize troops and push westward. At the very least, they aimed to extend the defense line 1,000 kilometers out and build it in the desert area. However, the war descended in a manner that nobody had anticipated, with greater speed and catching everyone more off guard than ever before. 3 days later, sitting in his office having just had another phone call with his mother, exchanging updates on the political maneuvering within the Star Sector, he learned that the Fatches family was indeed getting anxious. They had decided to use their influence with the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion stationed in the Tianma Star Sector to divert a portion of the Star Realm Army, originally planned to be dispatched to Corollia 3, to Rage Owl Star. The exact number of troops was still under discussion, the method of their deployment was still being negotiated, who would bear the cost of deployment was an ongoing conversation, and how to avoid making the Imperial Navy too sensitive was also being discussed. Gu Heng urged for a quick resolution. The battle was about to begin and he needed the Star Realm Army forces to arrive as soon as possible. And just as he hung up the phone, Gu Heng heard the piercing sound of alarms blaring over the skies of Revival City. His face instantly turned somber. The guards outside nearly burst into his office. Governor! Level 1 alert! Our intelligence personnel have discovered missile silos in the Western Desert. Missiles have already been launched eastward. When did this happen? Just now. Based on the timing, it's been 15 minutes since the missile launch. The guard didn't mention how many missiles there were, the power of the missiles, nor their exact targets or whether they could reach Revival City. Yet, a sense of extreme urgency rang through Gu Heng's heart. How could they not reach? Otherwise, was Blackbird just setting off fireworks? That was clearly not the case. Governor, please hurry to the air raid. No. Gu Heng rejected the guard's suggestion and immediately left the office. Harnessing his spiritual energy, he levitated and soared into the air, gazing westward with keen eyes. Chapter 464. He didn't need to hide in an air raid shelter, the missiles wouldn't claim his life. But for the residents of the Alliance and the Alliance's factories, it was a different story. And after he ascended, he indeed saw missiles with long trails blazing through the clear sky, roaring toward him. At the same time, many red beams were fired from a great distance. Some of these red beams originated from Revival City and others from Wuxing City. He couldn't hear any sound, but Gu Hang could see, through his viewport, that most of the missiles streaking across the clear sky were hit by red beams and exploded in mid-air. He was somewhat relieved. These red beams came from the reflector laser cannon, which is essentially an anti-aircraft weapon. Its most common uses are twofold: placed on the ground for air defense and long-range anti-orbital bombing, and on starships, to blast approaching landing craft, incoming live munition firepower, and counter-collide with energy attacks from enemy ships. Even if they couldn't intercept all, they could reduce the power of the enemy's energy attacks. Originally, Gu Hang had acquired the technology for the reflector. The Alliance also had sufficient resources and prerequisite technologies to produce them on a large scale. But earlier on, the Alliance didn't have a strong demand for reflectors. On one hand, the Alliance didn't have starships, so there wasn't a need to produce hundreds of reflectors for starships all the time. On the other hand, the enemies the Alliance had encountered up until then didn't have any notable air force, so there was little need for air defense firepower. Most of the produced reflectors were castrated versions, with reduced size, power, and energy consumption, and were placed on Lion tanks as main or secondary armaments. Featuring a full suite including radar, interception, servo-skull computational recognition systems, and precision interception firepower, the production numbers for the complete reflector systems were indeed not many. It was only through the use of black boxes, which guaranteed the production of a complete set each time, that some were made. The mass production lines set up by the Alliance produced very few of these full system suits. These produced air defense systems were mainly installed in Revival City and Wuxing City. And at this very moment, such deployment played a tremendous role. In Revival City, there were a total of 11 complete reflector systems. Wuxing City had around 20 or more sets. The continuous firing of beams intercepted most of the missiles in mid-air. In the end, only one missile actually reached the skies above Revival City. But it didn't explode. With a wave of his hand, Gu Hang used his spiritual energy to capture it, crushing it into scrap metal in mid-air. But his expression remained extremely grave. Revival City here may have just had a false alarm, but what about the other places? Wuxing City didn't have a top-tier spiritual energy user like Gu Hang to perform this final line of defense. Although the number of reflector systems was more than double that of Revival City, could they intercept all the missiles? The situation in Wuxing City was still manageable, at least with its 20-plus reflector systems, but what about other places in the Alliance? The front lines, where the main forces of the Alliance were assembling and acting, what about them? But worrying now was useless. After confirming that no more missiles were coming from the horizon, Gu Hang slowly descended and returned to his office. Then, relevant intelligence started to pile up in his office like snowflakes. The first to report were the air defense systems of Revival City and Wuxing City. These systems detected 45 incoming missiles. 15 aimed at Revival City and 30 at Wuxing City. Revival City intercepted 14, with one unknown, crushed by Gu Hang. Wuxing City, on the other hand, intercepted 29, with one exploding in a factory, destroying a production line for alloy plastic steel, killing 7 people and injuring more than 30. All the injured had been sent to the hospital, and the damaged factory had already been scheduled for emergency repairs. The second piece of intelligence came from the troops assembling on the front line. At least 50 missiles launched an attack on them. But the front-line troops had their own air defense firepower. In the 5th-generation Walker series armored vehicle that Gu Hang had previously allocated, although the most produced were the Forwarder armored transport vehicle and the Strider infantry fighting vehicle, there was also the Defender series of anti-aircraft combat vehicles in this series. The Alliance had been continuously producing related equipment, and almost every division was equipped with an anti-air unit or battalion. These field air defense vehicles were equipped with actual anti-aircraft guns, which were not as accurate as the reflector, nor did they have servo skulls for assistive calculations, significantly reducing interception efficiency. But the number of air defense vehicles supplied to the field army was still substantial. Out of the 50 missiles, 38 were intercepted. The remaining ones, although they did explode, didn't hit the areas with the highest concentration of personnel and equipment right away. The specific casualty report hadn't come out yet, but the total number was expected not to exceed 150. By this step, Gu Hang was already feeling pained. But he knew that the worst had not yet arrived. Indeed, after waiting a little longer, 2 more cities in the Alliance reported attacks. Baegu City in Biking Valley Province also suffered a missile attack. 10 missiles exploded in Baegu City, causing no less than 500 casualties, completely destroying a food processing plant and a food warehouse, with the specific material losses yet to be counted. Additionally, the former rubbish town, now Jayota City, also suffered an attack. 15 missiles destroyed the municipal government of Jayota City, causing no less than 500 direct casualties and also destroying a low-energy storm collection factory, causing a sympathetic explosion. The related sympathetic explosion resulted in 80% of the workers in that factory being out of touch, which was about 1,000 people in scale. Looking at all this information coming together, Gu Heng's face was so dark it seemed it might drip ink. Blackbird Heavy Industries possessed intercontinental strike capabilities, enabling them to precisely deliver long-range missiles from a distance of 1 to 10,000 kilometers, which he hadn't expected. Although the power of these missiles did not seem too great, even weaker than the scalpel missile that Gu Heng had seen before, the act itself was extremely heinous. The fact that 120 intercontinental missiles had been launched and the losses had been secondary, the most frightening aspect was that it exposed a vulnerability of the alliance, no countermeasure capability. The alliance lacked intercontinental strike means. And due to previous negligence, the construction of the alliance's air defense system was not up to par. The casualties in Jayota City and Baegu City totaled 2,000 people. Although they were all civilians, they were an important workforce. Not to mention that factories and warehouses were destroyed, the loss of materials and means of production would be difficult to calculate in a short time. Thankfully, Revival City and Wuxing City were spared, otherwise, if the 45 missiles that hit these two cities had all detonated on impact, the results would be unimaginable. The population density and industrial importance in these places were much higher than those in Baegu City and Jayota City. What made Gu Heng feel even more alarmed was that he still did not know the extent of Blackbird's intercontinental missile delivery capability. Could they only deliver these 120 missiles at a time? How many intercontinental missiles did they have in reserve? Was this attack a sudden all-out strike, or simply a probing move? Did they have any big shots far more powerful than these 120 missiles? All these unknowns were unnerving for him as a ruler. But although he was distressed, he did not panic in his actions. He immediately made a call to the Blade Tiger. Colonel Yeliziah, I want you to carry out a full-force orbital strike on Blackbird City immediately, no holding back. Chapter 465. The Alliance indeed lacked the capability for intercontinental strike capability. Their domestically produced missiles couldn't reach nearly 20,000 kilometers away. But just because the Alliance didn't have it, didn't mean they didn't have other tricks up their sleeve. Now, within the Empire's conventional firepower, why wasn't there much advocacy for the development of long-range ground strikes? There were 3 reasons. 1 was that long-range strikes were expensive, 2, current air defense technology was quite exaggerated, boasting high interception efficiency. But the reason a weapon's appearance gets significantly reduced is rarely because it has many natural predators, but rather because its role was supplanted by another type of weapon. The thing that significantly replaced intercontinental weapons was orbital bombardment. The Blade Tiger could lend a hand with that. In the communication, Yeliziah said no problem. Regarding the intelligence breach about Blackbird violating the intelligence ban, Gu Heng did not notify her immediately. Not until things got underway on his mother's end and talks began the matter wasn't too confidential then did Gu Heng inform Yeliziah. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, she wasn't one of his own. If he told her 1 second, the Fufana family would know the next, and Pei Desi would likely find out the second after that. Now it didn't matter. Yeliziah didn't make much of it, just scolded teasingly for not telling her sooner and complained a few times about how many things happened on Rage Owl Star. In reality, Gu Heng could feel that this naval commodore was quite eager. There was merit to be earned. Yeliziah enthusiastically arranged for the Blade Tiger to move in planetary orbit, preparing to initiate orbital bombardment on Blackbird City. Meanwhile, Gu Heng began to arrange another move. Before Blackbird Heavy Industries launched the missile attack, the Alliance had received a warning from an intelligence agent at the front. Although the warning came a bit late and didn't serve as a pre-warning, as the missiles arrived shortly after, Gu Heng didn't forget what they mentioned. Missile silos detected. Since that was the case, it was time for tit for tat. True, the Alliance lacked the means for intercontinental strikes and couldn't directly bombard the missile silos. Blade Tiger's target was also Blackbird City, not the missile bases specifically. But the Alliance had other means. Under Gu Heng's command, the Wind Falcon took off, carrying the Phoenix. Heavenly fire descended. Iron fetches sat within the metallic throne atop the high tower. Unlike most of the modified humans in Blackbird City, Iron Fetch's outward appearance hadn't changed significantly, she still retained the flesh and blood of humanity. Only her deep blue eyes twinkled with an inhuman electric light. Atop the mechanical tower, connected to the observation monitor at the top, her viewpoint elevated and extended. In her gaze, a strike from beyond the planet's atmosphere descended from the heavens. The equipment on the escort ship consisted of the all-firepower versions of Reflector and Defender. This was an entirely different concept from the anti-air reflector produced by the Alliance or the laser cannons mounted on tanks. While the technology was the same, the power and intensity were more than tenfold. The force of the Scalpel missile was also several times more ferocious than those launched by Blackbird Heavy Industries that had attacked the Alliance's intercontinental missiles. These weapons were hurling towards Blackbird City without holding back. A layer of azure light appeared over the skies of Blackbird City. This was a massive energy shield generator, and the first wave of strikes from space was stalled. The second volley met the same fate. The shield generator flickered but did not turn red. The shield generators equipped in Blackbird City were strong on their own, and simple bombardment from S-grade ships couldn't easily shatter them. However, this was after all a situation of passively taking hits. Blackbird City lacked adequate anti-orbital firepower to directly attack from the ground to space. There were some orbital air defense installations, but they were insufficient to intercept every round of bombardment from the Blade Tiger. What made matters worse was that although the shield generators of Blackbird City weren't small, they couldn't cover the entire city. They shielded only about half of the city's area, barely managing to cover the core district, but many peripheral areas remained unprotected. The Blade Tiger above sensed this too. After 2 rounds of ineffective bombardment, they changed tactics, beginning to target the areas outside of the energy shield's coverage. Soon, apart from the central district, the peripheries of Blackbird City began to blossom with explosions, and flames shot into the sky. Iron Fetches could see it all clearly. She knew this was already a relatively good outcome. Currently orbiting Rage Owl Star was only an old model of Blade Tiger, one of the weakest in firepower among escort ships. If it had been the Quintet, a properly outfitted main cruiser, with an L-class heavy cannon Wrath of Loyalty raining down non-stop, let alone the outskirts, not even the energy shield over the city's heart might have been able to withstand it. That had been her greatest fear. Within the family, she was an overlooked member. She had no outstanding abilities, nor a particularly valued position. 6 years ago, a freshly adult Iron had just taken a job in the government of Fetches II, where she worked decently and without mistakes for 3 years. Chapter 466. Just as she began to wonder if her life would simply pass by on Fetches II, no different from any other ordinary member of the family, an opportunity presented itself to her. The family was recruiting someone to head Blackbird Heavy Industries at Rage Owl Star. The previous manager had retired, and the family needed a direct descendant to take over the operations there. What was Rage Owl Star like 3 years ago? It was a barren planet, a backwater that repeatedly failed to meet the imperial tax, a place shunned by the direct descendants of the family as if it were a snake or scorpion, and no ambitious person with prospects would willingly suffer there. To put it plainly, it was just an idle piece in the family's game on Rage Owl Star to establish some industries, make some money, relying on the fact that the previous planetary governors couldn't collect the taxes to score some extra income. Of course, it wasn't that the family didn't harbor thoughts of expansion. They planned to use Blackbird Heavy Industries to continually extend their influence on Rage Owl Star, to secure the position of planetary governor at the least cost, and ultimately bring this insignificant planet into the Fetches family's territory. Iron signed up. Initially, she wasn't sure she wanted to go. People around her said it was too harsh there. The family had plans but didn't value it highly, going there would be a waste of her youth, and she felt apprehensive about it. But on one hand, she didn't want to live the rest of her life in comfort but predictability. On the other hand, she just wanted to try, not truly believing that someone as ordinary as herself would be selected. And then she was indeed chosen. Perhaps it was because the capable and esteemed members of the family looked down on this destination, yet she was a Fetches by blood, and her past record was one of honest and obedient service. In any case, whatever the reason, she became the Fetches family's choice to oversee the operations of Blackbird Heavy Industries. With a nervous heart, she arrived here and began her work. The business didn't require too much of her attention. Her predecessor, an elder from the family, had left a solid foundation, and it wasn't a total mess. Everything operated smoothly according to the arrangements he had left in place. However, she still encountered problems later. She wasn't truly incompetent. Within the internal management, she gradually discovered something amiss. The production capacity of Blackbird Heavy Industries was much larger than expected. The startup capital given by the family was minimal, the support they provided was sparse. The production conditions here were poor. According to her understanding, Blackbird Heavy Industries should not have the production capacity she was witnessing. And she quickly understood why. Under her watch, the automated production lines were operating day and night. Many of the industrial workers had long been transformed into tireless, food and drink-free mechanical augmentees, who only needed to be charged, supplied with energy, and they could operate according to commands. Without a doubt, this had crossed the line of the imperial edict against smart mechanisms. She solemnly summoned the relevant overseers and discussed this issue seriously, but she found that they didn't consider it a big deal. What's the harm in it? The imperial edict is one thing, but who cares about it on Rage Owlstar? The planetary governors, who in principle should monitor all anomalies within their territories, are each unsure if they can survive another 2 years, sitting like clay statues in Revival City to the east, unable to even control their own governments, let alone handle matters on the continent's far west. Here the Emperor's writ runs thin, anything goes. Moreover, as for the so-called ban on smart mechanisms, that's making a mountain out of a molehill. They're just simple automated machines, just bumping up the degree of human modification a bit further, especially modifying the brain. How is that any different from a servitor? Where could that possibly lead to a serious issue, a crisis with smart mechanisms? They truly didn't believe that those augmented humans, those automated machines, would suddenly revolt one day. They had been doing this for a long time, ever since the previous president of Blackbird Heavy Industries was in charge. And nothing had gone wrong. Even, those in charge had told her that it wasn't just at Blackbird Heavy Industries, on the Fatches family's home turf, the Fatches 1/2/3 planets, there were also automated machines in operation. However, on those 3 traditional planets of the Fatches family, there would always be imperial officials inspecting, and the situation on the planets was more complex. They dared not be too blatant, so they could only operate on a small scale and in a very covered manner. After all, the impact of automation on increasing productivity and reducing production costs was too immediate and evident. Initially, Iron was panicked. Even after listening to the explanations from the supervisors, she felt something was off. She was afraid that the events she'd read about in history books and some legendary tales would befall her one day. Imperial wrath descending from the heavens, burning away all traitors, and she, herself, would be that imperial traitor. But she dared not put a stop to it all. She could see that the specific officers in charge would not agree easily. She felt that if the violations were reported to the family, she, as the person in charge, would be the one to ultimately take the blame and be ostracized by the family. The production quotas set by the family, the expansion targets, they couldn't possibly be met without strong production capabilities behind them. Even the control over the entire western continent might not be maintained. She consented to it all, only asking that they not delve deeper. Then, during an inspection, she accidentally fell from a height of 2 stories, sustaining a comminuted fracture of her left foot, making recovery difficult, so she accepted the mechanical augmentation of her left foot. This was a common occurrence. In many parts of the Empire, similar mechanical augmentations took place, and as long as the brain wasn't altered, there shouldn't be much of a problem. After the augmentation was completed, her mechanical left foot, although very useful, sometimes gave her the vague feeling that it had its own consciousness. In the time that followed, she began to see some cold illusions before her eyes. She found her logical thinking ability had become extremely strong, but as a consequence, she began to feel she was slowly losing some human emotions, becoming more and more indifferent. One day, a year ago, she felt that she was about to be driven mad, yet her emotions remained strangely calm. She picked up a knife and cut open the flesh at the juncture where her left calf connected to the machine, only to see the upper part of her limb that should have been her own, that should not have been altered, and, beneath the flesh where there should have been white bone, there was a dark grey metallic substance. She should have been shocked, terrified, but she wasn't. She just calmly cut open the flesh on her arms, which, by all accounts, should show no trace of modification, to see that inside were still metallic bones. Then she broke her left hand, and inside the skeleton, there were mechanical structures, cables. In her mind, knowledge that shouldn't have belonged to her surfaced, giving her a clear understanding that these cables and mechanical structures were what supported her body's operation. The modifications to her body had not stopped for a moment over the past 2 years, starting with her left foot, gradually replacing her bones, the structure of her blood. Now, she might still appear outwardly indistinguishable from a normal human, but in essence, she had become another species. But Iron Fatches wasn't panicked, she just calmly repaired her broken arm, watched as the falsely fleshy exterior regenerated completely, and went back to whatever she was doing. She had heard that a new planetary governor had arrived from the east, who had even sent envoys. After learning about the various deeds he had done on the planet, she began to make some additional preparations silently. Building intercontinental missile silos, constructing shield generators, adjusting the production capacity of Blackbird Heavy Industries from producing products required by the Fatches family to producing military goods, increasing the number of augmented humans. She was preparing for a future that her logical mind deemed inevitable, and now, that future had arrived. Chapter 467. Iron Fatches knew that she couldn't possibly stay hidden in the western continent forever, and quietly develop according to her past plans, slowly building up force before sweeping across the entire planet. The new governor was different from all his predecessors. He rapidly unified the entire eastern side of the continent and turned what was once a nominal alliance back into a tangible entity. And even went a step further. The so-called alliance was in name only, its unification bore no resemblance to an alliance. It was essentially a highly efficient centralized government. And with the governor's actions in the eastern part of the continent, it wouldn't be long before he reached out his claws. She was prepared, just hoping that it would happen as late as possible. The later, the stronger the forces she could accumulate. The leaking of intelligence was inevitable. Blackbird City was airtight but not a completely enclosed space. As long as there were material and personnel exchanges with the outside world, the leakage of the city's situation was unavoidable. She also knew that she could not win. If she only had to deal with Guhang and the 25 million humans gathered on the eastern continent, it might still be manageable. But what she was up against was the human empire. There would be the Star Realm Army, there would be the Imperial Navy, endless in number. But what if she couldn't win? In her mind, a voice was incredibly clear. Involve more humans in the glorious evolution. That was the goal. The bombardment of the Imperial Navy was something she had prepared for. The most important production had already been moved as much as possible to the central city protected by energy shields, another part had been buried in the underground sections of the city. The ones that couldn't be moved to the core city, in the outer districts, were also spread out as much as possible to avoid concentration. This limited the damage caused by the barrage from orbit. The orbital bombardment lasted almost a day. The Blade Tiger escort ship dispensed thousands of rounds of energy, kinetic, and missile fire onto the surface, bombing the outskirts of Blackbird City into ruins. All one could see was a sea of flames. But Iron Fatches remained unruffled. Her cold eyes flickered with electricity, her brain, now adapted to instruction and logic thinking mode, coldly calculated the losses. The productivity of Blackbird City had lost approximately 27% during the day's bombardment. The losses were certainly significant, but not fatal. And the Blade Tiger in the sky had also stopped its attack, it had run out of ammo. Meanwhile, a part of Iron's consciousness reached far beyond the range of Blackbird City, connecting to the 5 scattered missile launch bases across the western continent. Those bases continued to fire. The first wave of 120 intercontinental cruise missiles was just the appetizer. Over a long time, Blackbird Heavy Industries had produced over 4,000 intercontinental cruise missiles. She planned to launch all of these missiles within 8 days. You have orbital bombardment, I have intercontinental missiles. You have air defenses, I have energy shields and preemptive industrial evacuation. Let's inflict pain on each other. Anat's heart was ablaze with anger. Before departing, he and his battle brothers were in the Phoenix Monastery, engaging in routine training and prayer. He saw with his own eyes the roaring intercontinental missiles barreling toward Wuxing City and Revival City. Although most of the first wave was intercepted, there was almost a frequency of 4 missile volleys every hour as Blackbird Heavy Industries continued to launch attacks on the Alliance. The main targets were the large cities, especially Revival City and Wuxing City, the political and industrial hubs. The Alliance's air defense system, the never-before-used air defense reflectors, had never been as busy as now. Crazy beams of light shot into the sky, blowing up the missiles mid-flight, but there were always some that slipped through. He was very worried about his parents. Though, after becoming an angel of the Emperor and Governor, he hadn't yet visited his parents who had fled from the Green Valley region. The old veterans in the warband always cautioned them to cut the emotional ties and concerns from their time as mortals. They had given themselves wholly, becoming death angels, and should no longer harbor the emotions and thoughts of ordinary people. Anat told himself the same. But he soon realized there was no need to be so extreme. His mission was to bring destruction to the Empire's enemies, to the Alliance's enemies, to protect humanity, the Empire, and the Alliance. His parents were certainly subjects of the Empire, citizens of the Alliance, and there was no conflict between the two. The threat to his family from the missiles flying in from the west, as well as the damage they caused to the Alliance, were completely aligned, even overlapping. This stoked the flames of his fury. He desperately wanted to bring the fire of death to those enemies daring to harm what he was resolved to protect. And his chance was coming soon. The Allied Air Force's Wind Falcons swiftly descended upon the Phoenix Monastery, and their warband leader appeared before them. Chapter 468. No pre-battle mobilization was needed, not a single extra word had to be spoken, just a simple command, and the interstellar warriors boarded their respective rapid assault crafts. The reason mobilization wasn't necessary was that the old soldiers didn't need to be told. As for the new recruits, all conscripted from the Rage Owl Star Alliance, no one needed to fuel their rage toward enemies daring to harm their homeland, rather, it had to be slightly tempered to prevent the warriors from acting impulsively. All the interstellar warriors were divided into 5 squads. In fact, the current Phoenix battle group had well over 50 members. However, among them, quite a few had their superhuman organs still maturing. Additionally, another group had matured organs but no sufficient power armor to wear. In the end, those who donned power armor and were truly of use numbered only 27. Commander Maddens, Priest Rizzo, and 2 other veterans each led a team of 5 to a location, with the mission objective of destroying the missile silos there. The squads with veterans at the helm were not a concern. But that left only 4 old-timers, including Commander Maddens and Priest Rizzo, making it impossible to spare a 5th person to lead a team. Thus, the 5th team had to be led by a new recruit. Anat was the one selected as the temporary squad leader, and his squad had the most members of all 5 teams, numbering 7 warriors. Before departure, Commander Maddens and Priest Rizzo took him aside for a serious talk. Priest Rizzo was one thing, but Anat could clearly see that despite Commander Maddens' stern and indifferent facade, his scant words still betrayed the tension and worry within. Although Anat hadn't experienced the battle group's glory days or the grueling penitential crusade, he had read the history of the battle group in the monastery's library. The Phoenix, at its smallest, had been just 4 people, nearly meeting true death. Even now, the battle group hadn't recovered much vitality. A grand group with only 27 legitimate warriors was still very few and very vulnerable. Hence, the commander would never wish for any loss to the battle group, which explained his nervousness. With veterans leading the other 4 squads, there would be some oversight, but his own squad, composed entirely of new recruits, was the most likely to encounter problems. Anat fully understood Commander Maddens' concerns, which is why he also knew the importance of the responsibility he bore on his shoulders. He forced himself to calm down from the rage, not to suppress it, but to keep a clear head amid it. He assured the commander and the priest that he would surely bring every brother back safely upon mission completion. He made that promise, and he was about to fulfill it. He didn't want to disappoint the commander, nor did he want to let the governor down. At the same time, he was aware that if this battle were to succeed, it would establish his position within the battle group. In the future, the group would surely continue to expand, and it always needed new officers, squad leaders, and even members of the Glory Guard or champions of the battle group. And he needed to secure more honors for his future, laying down a foundational career. With this mentality, he and his brothers spent more than 10 hours on the Wind Falcon. During that time, he could see missiles trailing flames through the window, heading in the opposite direction, passing by them. He knew those missiles were aimed at his homeland. With each passing missile, more rage accumulated in his heart, yet at the same time, he became even more composed. Finally, they reached their destination. The 3 Wind Falcons cast waves of shipborne missiles from afar towards the target location, bombarding it. Immediately following, the rapid assault crafts began to decelerate and decrease altitude. Shortly after, when Anat could vaguely see the ground situation through the window, firepower from the machine guns and beam cannons on the Wind Falcons began to take effect. But at this moment, some ground-based long-range firepower, such as anti-aircraft guns, began firing into the sky, albeit with relatively poor accuracy and density. The 3 Wind Falcons were hit several times, but it wasn't problematic. The calibers of these anti-aircraft guns were not that fierce. As they fired, the entire craft began to drop sharply. Just over 10 meters from the ground, the hatch opened and the interstellar warriors leaped out. Mid-air, in the seconds before landing, Anat swiftly scanned the area, grasping the expected landing points of each teammate. Then, firmly grounding himself, he raised his grenade launcher and opened fire on a high-caliber firepower point approximately 200 meters away, suppressing the threat to the Wind Falcons as they decelerated. Meanwhile, he kept giving orders. Larson, Kavaz, at the 12 o'clock position, 300 meters out, that bunker is your target. Magnusson, Christians, 2 of you move out to the 3 o'clock direction, 400 meters away. Everyone else, follow me at a walk, advancing straight ahead, ready to support the flanks at any time. He issued commands in an orderly fashion. The 7-person squad split into 3 groups, targeting the bunkers ahead. This was the first challenge they would face. Blackbird tightly guarded their missile silos. Around the missile silos, the Phoenix warriors faced a cluster of bunkers. Dozens of partly underground, partly exposed bunkers tightly sealed the core area around the missile launch silos. In the direction of the Phoenix warriors' assault, there were at least 11 bunkers. These bunkers, scattered at intervals of about 1 to 200 meters, were manned by modified humans. These modified humans, with the help of solid defensive positions, offered stubborn resistance. Initially, their attention was primarily drawn to the Wind Falcons in the sky, with machine guns and rifles firing rapidly at the Wind Falcons. Slowing down the drop of the interstellar warriors made the Wind Falcons relatively easier to hit. Bullets tinkled against the armor of the Wind Falcons. Although none were brought down, they dared not linger and had to immediately accelerate, gaining altitude and distance. After driving away the Wind Falcons, they then turned their firepower on the interstellar warriors below. But by this time, the Phoenix warriors had already made significant progress forward, taking advantage of the brief window when their adversaries' attention had been drawn away by the Wind Falcons. The running speed of the interstellar warriors was so fast that it exceeded their expectations. These modified humans no longer possessed the concept of imagination, more accurately, it was outside the bounds of their programmed combat logic. The two sides began to exchange fire at less than 100 meters distance. In theory, the modified humans should have had an absolute advantage. They outnumbered the opposition, they were holed up inside bunkers, exposing only their firing ports, while the interstellar warriors on the other side had to advance through open terrain with no cover. However, the reality was the exact opposite. When they resolved to concentrate their firepower to eliminate the 3 warriors coming directly at them, they found that their bullets were as ineffective as a water gun's spray. A large volume of fire had been unleashed and many shots had hit their marks, but all they managed to do was slow down the advance of the 3 red-armored warriors. And then the counterattack arrived. Anat turned sideways, intentionally using the broad shoulder plates to block the bullets aiming for his upper body. He retracted his forearm to protect his armpits while also aiming his gun. Bullets tinkled against his armor, causing his body to tremble slightly. But he held firm against this force, taking steady steps forward while accurately aiming and pulling the trigger of his grenade launcher. Despite the quivering of his body from the impacts because the firing ports of the enemy bunkers were quite small, he still managed to fire off 13 grenades, with half of them blasting into the bunkers. This silenced the bunker right away. They no longer just foolishly stood taking hits, but quickly moved, using the silenced bunker to shield themselves from attacks from several other firing points, avoided the line of fire, and rapidly advanced to the position of the now vacated bunker. And at that moment, after the attention was mainly drawn to them, the 2 pairs of soldiers on the flanks also successfully completed their missions. The outer 3 bunkers had been captured just like that. What followed was simply continuing to advance in the same manner as before. Anat found this to be quite simple, like a drill, a sort of armed outing. Caution was necessary, but under the Phoenix's cold fury, Blackbird's defenses posed no threat. Chapter 469. Although they had only taken down 3 bunkers for the moment, Anat believed that the hardest step of the battle had already been completed. Even though there were 8 enemy bunkers remaining in the direction they faced, if they could take 3 out of 11 without much cost, what was so difficult about following the same tactic to take down another 8 after the firepower had been reduced by nearly a third? It was simply a matter of 2 to 3 more assaults with diminishing pressure. And indeed, that's exactly how it happened. Not only did the squad led by Anat advance unstoppably, but similar situations were also unfolding at the other 4 battle locations. While the squad led by Anat was making an unstoppable advance, breaking through one bunker after another, and heading toward the core area of the missile silo, inside their target location was Iron Fetches, seated amidst it all. There, she only had the upper half of her body, head, and face that still resembled a human. The lower half, however, had completely become a mechanical monster, akin to an 8-legged mechanical spider. Her lake blue eyes flickered with electric light. Her logic brain wove one battle command after another, issuing them to the modified human combat troops on the front lines. At the same time, a stream of frontline battle messages were transmitted into her mind. Her battle logic system quickly processed these pieces of information. All of this should have been very methodical. Logical computation, issuing commands, frontline action, feedback of information, and then back to logical computation. This cycle should have been going on continuously, with the entire battle situation running in Iron Fetch's mind like a cold yet oddly beautiful machine. But the reality was completely different. The information and the process of logic computation in her mind were filled with chaos and errors. Hit detected, 3 Wind Falcon rapid attack vessels spotted, anti-aircraft fire engaging. Wind Falcon slowing down, suspected to be deploying ground forces. Prepare to strike with full force when they are stationary for deployment. Feedback received, Wind Falcons not stationary. Ground forces have jumped from 13.2 m in the air while the flyers were in motion, surpassing expectations. Recalculating. Target confirmed as interstellar warriors, calculations for frontal bunker firepower distribution underway. Support troop movement calculations underway. Expectation that the outer bunkers could hold for over 30 minutes, modified human combat troops movement route confirmed. Error, reinforcement troops eliminated. Revising the firepower assessment of the interstellar warriors' firearms. Error. Bunker lost in 6 minutes, unable to achieve expected defense effect. Recalculating reinforcement troops requirements. Redeploying firepower arrangement for the second layer of bunkers. Error. The second layer of bunkers cannot hold. Revising evaluation of interstellar warriors' shooting accuracy. Everything was in chaos, complete chaos. In Iron Fetch's mechanical brain, everything was quickly becoming a mess. All plans, whether they had just been made or were only halfway executed, were encountering errors and were forced to be modified. After modification, errors would occur again, unexpected situations kept happening one after another. She was already a mechanical being, and in her cold now quite overheated thought process, the condition of panic would no longer occur. But another situation worse than that could arise, a system crash. In a certain link of logical computing, perhaps due to some computational conflict or simply insufficient computational power, the eyes of Iron Fetches flickered rapidly, but for quite some time, he transmitted not a single command. Reflected on the front line, Anat's team suddenly felt that the firepower they were facing had become completely disorganized. Although the enemy's interdiction forces, whether light or heavy machine guns or small amounts of individual anti-armor weapons, had not posed any effective threat to them before, it had to be admitted that the enemy's firepower, no matter how much it was hit, was rigid but overall orderly. At this moment, even the advantage of orderliness was lost. Anat did not hesitate, he seized this opportunity and led his team to charge forward, capturing and destroying the third tier of bunker groups with relative ease compared to before. By now, the core location of the missile launch site was within reach. Anat did not intend to stop or rest, pressing on at once to complete the mission was the best course of action. 4 interstellar warriors, relying on 2 cleared bunkers, covered from both the left and the right with gunfire, inflicting heavy casualties on the disorientated and inexplicably exposed mechanical modified human soldiers. Anat and 2 other brothers in arms were running towards the missile launch shaft at high speed, staying roughly 2 meters apart from each other. Each of them was carrying a high-yield hot melt explosive. A single one was enough to destroy a large area. Anat estimated that he and his brothers in arms only needed to install 2 hot melt explosives in the right locations to destroy the missile launch site. And this was not difficult for them at all. The enemy could no longer stop their advance, and Anat had also identified the most suitable installation sites, which he communicated to his 2 brothers through the communication system in their helmets. What followed should have been simple: reach the destination, install the explosives, then retreat. However, at that moment, a sound like swarming bees reached Anat's ears. He immediately became alert. Yet, he did not slow down. After all, his mission target was ahead, and no matter what appeared, he had to go there. He merely heightened his vigilance and warned all his brothers in arms. And in the next moment, swarms of flying drones emerged from the missile launch shaft. A massive swarm of unmanned drones, each with a diameter of less than half a meter, and their black bodies did not even carry any reliable weapons. Yet, a prolonged alarm sounded in Anat's mind. With his superhumanly modified vision, he could clearly see that almost every drone was strapped with a bomb. Clearly, the attack method of these drones was not to utilize any sophisticated weaponry. All the fancy stuff was useless, a robust kamikaze drone attack was the most reliable. Regular bullets indeed could not penetrate the power armor of the Phoenix warriors, but what about kamikaze drones? If one didn't do the trick, what about 10? What appeared before them were far more than 100. A grave challenge had finally arrived. Chapter 470. Anat's expression became stern and tense. He immediately alerted his brothers in combat about the change in situation and requested fire support from the 4 teammates in the distance. The space warriors encountered a swarm of drones flying out from the launch wells at a distance of about 40 meters, a range at which their shooting accuracy was fully guaranteed. With a diameter of generally 40 to 50 centimeters, hitting these drones with a bomb gun would guarantee their destruction. However, the distance between them continued to close in a very short amount of time. Although drones were being blown up in the air, the numbers were still too great. The hundreds of drones flying out were destroyed at the exit, causing a chain of secondary explosions, and in a moment's time, more than 30 had been lost. This was the limit of the Phoenix warriors' superhuman shooting precision. Bomb guns also needed to be reloaded. During the lapse in firepower, the remaining drones would be able to reach their faces. In the blink of an eye, Anat made a startling decision. He pulled out a thermite bomb, activated it, and then threw it with all his might at the drone swarm. Then he took a big step back, even jumping backward abruptly, lying halfway back, but tilting the gun barrel high, accurately hitting the thermite bomb in mid-air. The thermite grenade exploded with a bang, spewing deep red heat flow in all directions, and the significant blast area destroyed a dozen drones. The suicide bombs carried by the drones caused a chain explosion, which propelled the hot, high-temperature incendiary fluids even further outward, thereby destroying even more drones. At least 40 suicide drones disappeared in that wave. But the situation was still not safe, with 30 drones still heading their way. "Draw your swords!" Anat shouted, quickly getting up and drawing his close-quarters weapon, the chainsaw sword. The Alliance had a production line for imported chainsaw swords, although the output was very small, the demand wasn't very high to begin with. 27 space warriors, 1 sword each, posed no problem. The roaring of the chainsaw started as he struck down 2 nearby drones, not allowing them to get close. The destroyed drones didn't even manage to detonate their bombs before losing their ability to move. However, there was no such opportunity after that. The reach of his arm plus the length of the chainsaw sword allowed him to destroy drones at a maximum distance of nearly 4 meters, but that was the furthest extent. What about the blast radius of a suicide drone? When it became clear that getting close enough to maximize the explosive power was unrealistic, a new command seemed to have been issued. A drone exploded at a distance of 7 or 8 meters from Anat, taking out another alongside it. The edge of the fiery blast enveloped Anat. The impact force made him stagger backward, and he felt countless steel ball bullets hitting his body. And it was at this moment, more drones passed through the flames and into the explosion, detonating one after another. Aside from the few that were slashed by the warriors in close quarters and a few ignited by the supporting fire of the brothers behind them, at least 23 suicide drones exploded around Anat in that instant. The 2 other Phoenix warriors charging with him, spaced not far apart, were of course also caught in the blast. The 4 brothers in the rear felt a tightness in their hearts. They could no longer see what was happening in the center of the explosion. They called out for the interim team leader over the comms channel but received no further response. This caused some panic among them for a moment. On one hand, the potential loss of 3 battle brothers was a concern, on the other, how to proceed with the subsequent mission was another issue. Just as they were unable to react further, a massive figure, standing at least 4 or 5 meters tall, crawled out of the missile silo. The 4 interstellar warriors providing fire support from a distance aimed their weapons at the figure and pulled the triggers. However, all of the grenade gun bullets were blocked by a layer of blue light that appeared in front of the emerging figure. Only then did the interstellar warriors see clearly what had come out. It had a humanoid upper body resembling a slender, graceful human female with only the key areas covered in copper iron structures, the rest was creamy white skin. Below the waist, though, was a massive spider-shaped body with 8 legs. In the center of the spider's body was a core emitting blue light, which must have been where the shield generator was located. This shield generator must have been the lowest grade, as just the concentrated barrage from 4 grenade guns made the blue light, indicative of the energy shield, flicker intensely. But no matter how low grade, it was still a bona fide energy shield, breaching it would take some time. At least, the interstellar warriors emptied an entire magazine from their grenade guns in a matter of seconds, hitting the target with nearly every shot, yet only managed to make it flicker. Conversely, the spider-shaped mechanical monster was about to counterattack. Its eyes turned a penetrating blue, light condensed within them, hinting at an imminent burst. Its gaze was fixed on one warrior. The Phoenix Newblood being stared down was named Raman Kawaz. He felt the lethal threat coming and immediately retracted his gun, throwing himself to the side to dodge. But the creature's gaze followed him closely. The next moment, 2 laser beams shot out from the eyes of Iron Fatches. The concrete wall of the bunker that Kawaz dodged behind was immediately burned through, creating a large hole. In no more than a second or two, the bunker wall would be penetrated, threatening to burn onto the interstellar warrior. But in that split second, a red figure burst out from the smoke of the recent explosion. That was Anat. Steamy smoke was still rising from his body, which was even slightly reddened. His helmet was nowhere to be found, likely discarded by himself, revealing a young face that looked exceedingly fierce at the moment. Roar! His raging voice followed. The energy shield couldn't stop his advance. He passed through the azure shield about 2 meters in front of Iron Fatches, and his chainsaw sword, ready to strike, swung close towards Iron Fatches. Another chapter to come later. Estimated before 2 a.m., it's late, don't wait up, read it in the morning. Chapter 471. Iron Fatches would never be caught off guard. But even the process of visual system detection, logical calculation, command transmission, and mechanical response, all of these still required time. And time was exactly what they didn't have. Her laser-emitting eyes had already started moving downward, toward Anat, but as the lasers burned a hole into the pockmarked shoulder armor of Anat, the light abruptly stopped. Because Anat's chainsaw sword arrived faster than even his roar of rage. The roaring chainsaw blade, filled with fury as if returning from hell itself, struck Iron Fatches' mechanical spider body with a solid blow. The external metal defense shell could not stop the chainsaw sword. Amidst a shower of sparks, a vast fissure was cut open, revealing the crackling electric light inside. This directly led to a problem in the energy supply of Iron Fatches' entire body, and at the 2 places with the highest energy consumption, the energy shield and the high energy beams emitted from her eyes, both abruptly cut off. The next moment, Anat let go of his chainsaw sword and, summoning strength in his legs, leaped up, grabbing Iron Fatches' slender neck with one hand. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but Anat ignored her completely and, with a sudden burst of strength, yanked to the side, snapping Iron Fatches' neck outright. Her attractive head fell by Anat's feet, then was ruthlessly crushed under his crimson iron boot. With that forceful stomp, the head exploded into a mess of parts on the ground. Afterward, Anat pulled out the chainsaw sword embedded in the spider's body and swung it wildly, dismembering the machine into pieces within a matter of seconds. All right. All right. All right. A comrade in arms who had caught up grabbed Anat's shoulder. Anat, gasping for breath, turned around and saw it was Raman Kawaz. He had just managed to save Kawaz. But now, Kawaz seemed concerned. He had been calling for Anat over the communicator earlier, but Anat had already taken off his helmet, and it seemed he had lost his earpiece too, unable to hear. Kawaz had no choice but to approach him. To him, Anat's state was worrisome. The earlier battle seemed normal at first. But later on, Anat's chainsaw sword maniacally dismembered the spider machine, evidently losing control of his state of mind. This was not the behavior expected from a calm interstellar warrior. Kawaz asked, "What happened to you?" Anat, breathing heavily, seemed somewhat bewildered. Had he just felt completely engulfed by a fierce rage, his mind filled with nothing but desires to destroy, to demolish, to annihilate, as if devoid of all reason? And now, as these feelings ebbed away like the tide, he felt an overwhelming weakness and a very intense pain all over his body. He lowered his head to glance at his armor, which was severely damaged. Sitting slumped on the ground, he didn't pay much attention to that. He said to Kawaz, "Never mind that, just go and complete our mission." Kawaz indeed didn't say anything more. He knew now was not the time to worry about a comrade in arms' injuries. Although the drones were gone and the spider-shaped mechanical monster had been destroyed, there were still many cyborgs around. Like headless flies, acting on basic combat logic, they continued to reinforce the area relentlessly. The other 3 interstellar warriors formed a defensive line to hold back the enemy. Moreover, their situation wasn't much better. Aside from Anat himself, the other two brothers-in-arms who had charged with him lay fallen not far away. The situation had to be resolved quickly and could not be delayed any longer. Kurs gritted his teeth, turned, and left to retrieve thermite bombs from the bodies of the two fallen brothers-in-arms. Clutching a bomb in one hand, he walked toward the missile silo. The pre-designated installation spot had already been communicated to him through the combat COMM system. He set the timer on the two bombs, installed them in the correct positions, and then turned and left again. After finding Anat again, Kavaz saw that the temporary squad leader had regained some strength and stood up, which was a relief. "We won't leave any brother behind," Anat said. Kavaz nodded silently and joined Anat at the side of the two downed Phoenix warriors. Each of them lifted one and began dragging them towards the evacuation point. The other three warriors quickly surrounded them, pouring fire into their surroundings to defend their brothers as they retreated to the perimeter. The evacuation route was the very path they had carved during their assault, where the bunkers had already been taken out. However, the number of modified human soldiers closing in on them was increasing. It was just bullets, which would have been manageable, but the appearance of enemies with rocket launchers and hand grenades could not be ignored. Moreover, even the most ordinary bullets were now lethal. Anat had lost his helmet. With the helmet on one side and supporting a fallen brother with the other, Kavaz fired at the enemy while also calling Wind Falcon over the built-in communication channel in his helmet. "We've completed the mission and are breaking through to the designated evacuation point, but we have casualties and are surrounded by the enemy. We request air support," he called. Wind Falcon received. "The new evacuation point has been adjusted and will be closer to you. Air support is on the way, hang in there," came the reply. Phoenix Squad received. After the communication was over, Kavaz was still full of doubts, but now was not the time to ask questions. They had to reach the evacuation point first. Fortunately, they didn't encounter any major issues along the way, especially after Wind Falcon arrived. By providing continuous strafing runs along the secure channel they had opened on the ground and facing weak anti-air fire, it helped alleviate a lot of pressure for the interstellar warriors. Eventually, they successfully reached the evacuation point and all boarded a Wind Falcon that was waiting there. They took off, leaving the area behind. Once on the aircraft, back in a safe environment, they finally had the opportunity to check the condition of the other two warriors they had dragged back. The outlook was not optimistic. They weren't dead, but their armor was severely damaged, and their bodies inside, though protected, were critically wounded. Heavy blood loss and brain damage had left them comatose. The medical systems integrated into their armor, which should have been active, had failed to function because these devices were the first to be damaged. But fortunately, they had not died on the spot. That was the best news. Brought back with medical assistance, given the superhuman physiques of the interstellar warriors, they should be able to recover. First, he gave his brothers 2 injections to sustain their vital signs. After finishing these tasks, Kavaz finally had a moment to turn to Anat with the question he had been holding back. "What exactly happened back there?" The question was loaded with meaning. "Why did you go crazy towards the end? Why were the other 2 brothers blown away, but you seemed to be fine?" But Anat looked perplexed. He didn't know how to respond. Chapter 472. Although it's difficult to explain, not knowing exactly what happened, Anat had no intention of hiding it. He clearly shared with his combat brothers the events of that split second. Along with the explosion came countless steel ball projectiles. Packing steel balls into the bomb was a rather insidious move but undeniably effective. The steel balls, scattered by the explosion, carried massive kinetic energy, greatly expanding the lethal range, turning any lightly armored unit into mush under such intense shrapnel bombardment. However, it was obvious that the Space Warriors, although infantry, could not be considered lightly armored. The specially treated Serre steel armor provided defense at certain points that was even on par with that of the Lion tanks. If a steel ball hit a vulnerable area, such as the armpit, the inner thigh, the waist junction, or the tactical visor of the helmet, it could be very dangerous, with the potential to penetrate. But to prevent this, Anat still made the correct response. He immediately squatted down on the ground, curling up his body as much as possible to reduce the area exposed to the blast. During this process, he used the thickest parts of his power armor to shield against the damage. He squatted down, bringing his legs together to protect the weaker inner thighs from attack. He tightened his body and joints to shield the critical parts. He clenched his arms to safeguard the armpits. He hunched his shoulders, using the sturdy shoulder armor. often served as a shield, to protect the sides of his helmet. These actions effectively ensured his safety. Not to mention, under the chainsaw sword, those drones couldn't get close and had to choose to explode from a distance of 6 to 7 meters, reducing their potency. However, if there had been only one kamikaze drone, with all these measures in place, he might have emerged unscathed. But after all, what exploded around them were over a dozen. In that extremely brief moment, his armor suffered too concentrated an assault. Metal fatigue pockmarked his armor, and the impact of the explosions, one after another, was not to be ignored. Theoretically, his fate should have been no different from the other two combat brothers also caught in the blast. However, in the midst of serious injury and unwilling to succumb, a raging fury erupted from his two hearts. He felt a surging warmth coursing through his entire body. This heat brought him incomparable strength and, in that brief time, he not only subjectively felt no pain, but also objectively ignored the severe internal injuries that the shockwaves had caused to his body. An infinite potential erupted from his body, and in that instant, he was not only like an uninjured person, but he also possessed a strength even greater than he had in his prime. He tore off his helmet which had been damaged by the explosion, where many integrated combat systems had failed and which had become an impediment to his vision and hearing, and then, following the power surging within him, he lunged forward, unleashing that strength upon the enemy, ultimately taking down the spider-like mech. But this power came quickly and left just as quickly. It lasted for less than half a minute before it faded. Even though the strength from within had dissipated, leaving him weak, his condition was still much better than the other two combat brothers who had suffered the blast. At least, he was not unconscious and even had the strength during the withdrawal to help drag a brother out of danger. The things Anat had recounted made Kavaz feel somewhat incredulous. "I have never felt anything like it." "Nor have I, this was a first," Anat responded. "This is highly unusual," Kavaz said with worry, "we might have to report this to the battle group leader." "My brother, I am very concerned that your body will suffer terrible consequences and injuries from this." Anat took a deep breath and replied, "Indeed, I was going to personally report the mission details to the battle group leader anyway, including the fact that two of our brothers were seriously injured. I will make sure to include this incident in my report as well." At this, he paused briefly before continuing, "I won't avoid you, nor any brother. When the time comes, you all should come with me." Hearing this made Kavaz feel somewhat reassured. Seeing how open Anat was being, he felt the situation he feared most probably wouldn't occur. The 5 action teams of Phoenix operated far apart, with Wind Falcons struggling to communicate directly with one another. It wasn't until they returned that they managed to speak with the battle group leader and the others. Martin Salas, the battle group leader, didn't wait for Anat's initiative to report. As soon as they returned, he convened a battle group meeting, gathering everyone together. The leaders of the 5 teams each reported their mission details, achievements, losses, and lessons learned. Every team had successfully completed their mission targets. Actually, the defense arrangements Blackbird Heavy Industries put in place at each of their missile launch sites were nearly identical: bunkers, modified human troops, swarms of kamikaze drones, and a female mechanical commander in spider form. Even the female commander looked exactly the same in each case. It was normal for the battle group leader's team to complete their mission. The defense capabilities of the Terminator power armor were the most exaggerated. Explosives that could grievously injure an interstellar warrior wearing standard tactical power armor felt like mere itching to the Terminator. The priest's smooth mission completion was also expected. A gravity field pushed forward, smashing almost every drone that broke through the fire blockade. The 2 veterans had another approach, unanimously choosing to have 4 rookies provide rear cover while they advanced alone. Upon detecting the drones, both veterans skillfully executed flanking maneuvers, luring explosions yet ensuring their own survival. It was only when that spider-form mechanical monstrosity appeared that they became somewhat flustered, sustaining injuries as a result, but still, they successfully completed the mission. The more Anat listened to these reports, the more restless he became. Regardless, it was his turn to recount the events eventually. He honestly relayed everything that happened, including his abnormal rage and the situation with his injuries recovery. Then he noticed that all eyes were on him. He felt guilty. The impressive combat achievements of the other 4 teams made him feel dull. Despite having 2 more people on his team compared to the others, 2 were seriously injured. He felt everyone's gaze was filled with contempt and blame. But unexpectedly, the first words from the battle group leader were uttered with a mixture of urgency and disbelief. "Did you truly experience a Phoenix event on your body?" Chapter 473. Rebirth. Gu Hang frowned, quite puzzled. After completing their behind enemy lines raid mission, Mattens, the battle group leader, had come looking for him. Originally, Gu Hang thought it was just a simple debriefing. He wondered why there wasn't a written report sent over and why there was a need for a face-to-face discussion. To his surprise, Mattens mentioned a special circumstance. He explained the unusual occurrence that had taken place in Anat to Gu Hang. Yes, Martin Salas began to explain in detail, rebirth is a characteristic of ours, the Phoenix. We have a long history, almost established right after the Age of Rebellion, as one of the first battle groups. Our progenitor, the Phoenix Legion, carries the blood of the Phoenix. But over the long span of time, our gene seed has undergone some strange mutations. Since the relationship between them had progressed to this point, there was nothing Martins couldn't discuss with the governor. Martins continued his narrative. It seems we have lost some of the talents of the Sons of the Phoenix, we no longer have the same love for art, our combat style has lost its love for flamboyance, and we've lost our sharp swordsmanship. Our way of fighting has become plain and simple. However, in exchange, we seem to have become more resilient and even stronger. The so-called rebirth is an even more intense change that occurs on top of those ordinary changes, appearing in only a select few. They may miraculously recover from grievous wounds, even near death, and possess strength, agility, and combat awareness even greater than normal. We refer to this condition as rebirth. Gu Hang listened thoughtfully. Star warriors generally look quite similar, but in reality, when the human emperor created these superhuman warriors, he designed a variety of genetic templates. Different legions were formed using different templates. These were the initial founding legions. They were largely consistent, but some differences in the details would result in star warriors produced from different gene seeds having innate physiological differences. This would manifest in each type of star warrior having different talents and strengths. The subsequent star warrior battle groups were all established after the Age of Rebellion, breaking down the larger legion organizations into battle groups of no more than 1,000 warriors, as mandated by the Star Warrior Codex. All the battle groups were split off from these initial founding legions. Despite the split, many battle groups would not forget their roots. Often, the battle groups have a close connection to their progenitor legion. In fact, they originally carried the same blood, the same gene seed. Just as the Phoenix battle group was divided from the Second Legion Phoenix Legion. All descendants of the Phoenix Legion were called Sons of the Phoenix, some staying closely unified with the progenitor legion, while others were more independent and distant. But their genetic origins were the same. From this perspective, the incident occurred within the Phoenix was quite special. Gu Hang spoke, is it caused by a mutation in the gene seed? That's one possibility, but it's not very likely. At this point, Gu Hang studied Martin's expression, not seeing any change. So he plainly stated, a more likely possibility is that the Phoenix's gene seed repository has been contaminated during the inheritance process. Please forgive my use of the term, but the characteristics you're describing resemble those reportedly possessed by the Blood Angels in battle, not when they are dying, but during intense combat. Nonetheless, this shouldn't be something characteristic of the Sons of the Phoenix. Martin sighed and said with a wry smile, now I am utterly convinced that the gene seed you've discovered truly belongs to the Phoenix, possessing even the unique genetic abilities of the Phoenix. Who could argue otherwise? Gu Hang smiled, that should never have been in question. But there will be trouble, Martin solemnly said, the battle group has already concluded its redemption mission, and by rights, we should be paying our gene seed tithe. Upon hearing this, Gu Hang remembered there indeed was such an issue. Star Warrior battle groups also have to pay taxes. However, their taxes are a bit different, they don't pay in material goods, but in gene seed. The amount required is 1/10 of the battle group's collected gene seed over a certain period. These gene seeds are sent to the capital, Holy Terra, and Mars. They serve two main purposes. First, to inspect the state of the battle group's gene seed, preventing contamination and corruption, ensuring they do not become traitors or join the Chaos Forces. This situation, although not publicly reported, actually happens quite frequently. After the Great Rebellion, with the exception of the 13th Legion Infinite Legion, almost every legion had traitors. The 10th Legion, once known as the Kangya Guards and now as the Chaos Sword, almost completely defected. The chaotic Starry Warriors gang is always a significant enemy of the Empire and a central force of chaos. Over the centuries since the Great Rebellion, there have also been numerous instances of battle groups becoming corrupted and joining chaos. The Empire is very vigilant about this, and regular inspection and control of the battle group's gene seed is naturally a top priority. As for the second purpose, naturally, it is to collect enough gene seed to establish new battle groups. From this point of view, the mutation in the Phoenix's gene seed is a very concerning matter. How did you deal with the gene seed tithe in the past? Gu Heng asked. Martins fell into reminiscence. When the battle group still had a pharmacist, we would examine each gene seed, selecting the ones that seemed most like the Phoenix to submit. And we've always kept in touch with the Progenitor Legion, explaining the situation to them. The Progenitor Legion understands our predicament and would help explain to Terra and Mars. However, they too have become increasingly puzzled by the changes occurring within us. Pausing, Martins pursed his lips and added another piece of information. Once we had a battle group leader who even tried to contact the Blood Angels to conduct a thorough comparative experiment between our gene seed, to clarify the specifics, but the Blood Angels refused. Chapter 474. Now, Gu Heng really started to feel a headache. There was indeed such a pitfall waiting for him on the Phoenix. The most likely situation with the Phoenix's genetic seeds issue was that at the time the warband was established, although most of the genetic seeds belonged to the Phoenix Legion, for some unknown reason, some of the Blood Angel seeds got mixed in. Or, it could be that during one instance of the warband receiving support and genetic seed replenishment, a batch of the seeds came from the Blood Angels. In some brutal, large-scale wars, it's indeed possible for such a mix-up to happen due to management errors if there was no conspiracy or deliberate action involved. And if you include the so-called conspiracy theories in consideration, that would become too complicated. It's not impossible, but there are too many possibilities, and the truth of history has long been submerged in the passage of time. It's now unclear and beyond our capability to investigate. It can only be left as is, for now. According to Martins, before the Sin Redemption expedition, the Phoenix wasn't too worried about inspections from the Empire government and the Mars Cultivation Association. On one hand, they had an abundant supply of genetic seeds from which they could select the ones most resembling the Phoenix Legion for inspection. On the other hand, they themselves were formidable, had considerable political influence, and had the support of the parent legion for cover. But now all these advantages are gone. The genetic seeds that Gu Xing exchanged were all standard Phoenix seeds, without any that were more similar to the Phoenix. And the Phoenix itself was no longer the powerful second-generation warband it used to be. It was fortunate not to have been annihilated. Also, because of the great mistake made in the past, they had long been severed from the parent legion, with no contact for over 100 years. Although they could try to re-establish this connection, over 100 years have passed, and whether the Phoenix still acknowledges the Phoenix that is suspected to be a wild breed, mongrel sub-legion is uncertain. As for the Blood Angels, which might be another part of the gene source for the Phoenix, they weren't even willing to perform a genetic inspection back then to see who the Phoenix warband actually belonged to, let alone now. These original warbands, each with its own independence and because they have glorious combat records in the millennia-old inheritance, with extraordinary influence over many political entities of the Empire, coupled with many close sub-warbands surrounding them, nearly every one of them is an independent political force within the Empire. And with their formidable military power and influence, almost no one dares to provoke them. And the Phoenix is no longer the relatively strong second-generation warband of the past. There is no longer a question of being unwilling to offend them. The Phoenix also underwent a Sin Redemption expedition, fought many dangerous enemies, and visited a lot of highly contaminated areas. It's uncertain whether, under such circumstances, after paying the genetic seed tax, the Empire would determine that there's a problem with the Phoenix's seeds and consequently provoke a major review targeting the Phoenix and the Rage Owl star harboring it. When it comes to the affairs of an interstellar warrior warband, Gu Heng, who could barely be considered a newly established planetary governor, truly has no means to influence such matters. This isn't as simple as a political struggle within a star sector. But soon, Gu Heng stopped dwelling on this issue and even tried to comfort Martins, saying, "There's always a way when you reach the mountains, no need to worry. The collection of the warband's genetic taxes isn't related to the Imperial Taxation Department, it's the Combat Corps Administration Bureau established jointly by the Mars Cultivation Association and the Empire government that's in charge. Since the Phoenix Legion ended its expedition, it has only been a short while, they couldn't possibly know where you all are and how much tax you need to pay so quickly. I'm not looking down on the Empire's management abilities, but their efficiency in managing these details is a complete mess. Who knows when the trouble will actually come?" Martins did not feel reassured after hearing Gu Heng's comforting words. Instead, his bitter smile became even more pronounced. Tax evasion, this is not something to be taken lightly in the Empire. Of course, interstellar warrior warbands have a bit more leeway compared to a planetary governor, especially those so-called fleet-based warbands without a home planet or conscription planet. Perhaps during an expedition, they might lose track of where they are amidst the fighting, and in the meantime, they may overlook paying taxes, and the Empire might not be able to find them, which is quite normal. The Phoenix now claims to be loyal to Mr. Gu, but this is just an agreed-upon relationship between them, formed by Mr. Gu providing genetic seeds, with all new blood of the warband pledging first loyalty to Mr. Gu, creating a strong binding relationship. But there is no such record in the official records of the Empire. Theoretically, finding Phoenix has nothing to do with Gu Hang. But, even though that's what he said, it wasn't that he couldn't do it, but Maddens just felt somewhat disloyal. Gu Hang continued, if push comes to shove, just hand over the seeds, if they want to start trouble, let them. It's not that we can't explain. Let them compare the seeds we're handing over now with those given by the Phoenix in its heyday 100 years ago. Can they really turn white into black? Maddens was still not at ease. Turn white into black? They really could. If it came to that, it would be too much of a last resort. Maddens started to consider the slightly disloyal suggestion previously made by Mr. Gu. Gu Hang only felt a slight headache about the Phoenix's predicament for a short while before he stopped worrying about it. It didn't make much sense to dwell on things he couldn't change or that would happen in the future. Gu Hang, whose strength was gradually filling out, wasn't made of clay either. He would never be like some planetary governors with inadequate foundations or lacking strength, who could be simply overthrown by the Empire sending a few agents from the legal department or judges from the tribunal. A 7th level, spiritually energized individual with divine realm enhancement? That's a joke. Moreover, the alliance structure he had built from scratch was undeniably loyal to him. Attempts at political subversion were also quite unrealistic. These shady tactics were the favorites of places like the Empire Legal Affairs Department and the Tribunal. They would usually handle the matter first, turning it into a fait accompli, and then announce the governor was a traitor. After all, the person would be dead already, the coffin lid nailed shut, and there'd be no way for them to refute it. But once these efficient methods failed, dealing with a planetary governor became troublesome, especially if that governor was paying taxes diligently. Following the proper administrative channels required evidence, multiple departmental reviews, and then a declaration that the planetary governor was a traitor to the Empire, followed by mobilizing the appropriate Empire troops for suppression. The respective declaration would also need to convince the action forces to accept it. The process would be long, troublesome, and would fully reflect the Empire's slow, rigid, and corrupt system. If the system wasn't this slow, rigid, and corrupt, to the point of being nearly irreversible, why would organizations like the legal department and the tribunal turn assassination and subversion into their most commonly used standard operations? That's because, by doing so, they can't handle the situation. And Gu Hang, his resistance to these tactics was already extremely high. He refocused his attention on the current conflict at hand. The Phoenixes behind the enemy line's special operations had achieved a complete victory. Although 2 had been severely injured and 3 sets of tactical power armor were damaged and would take months to repair, the Blackbird Heavy Industries intercontinental missile bases were all gone. Chapter 475. Blackbird Heavy Industries had lost their intercontinental ballistic missile launch capability. Not only had the 5 ballistic missile silos been destroyed, but many of the intercontinental missiles around the silos had also been destroyed. It wouldn't be easy for them to rebuild this capability in the short term, and there was no need to worry about this problem for at least a few months. Whether rebuilding the missile silos or replenishing the number of missiles, it was not something that could be completed overnight. Before the Star Warriors destroyed those missile silos, at least 500 intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched toward various locations in the Alliance. Most of the missiles were still aimed at Revival City, Wuxing City, and the frontline troops. In addition, a total of 80 missiles fell on Beigou City, Jeoda City, and Beigong City, renamed from Extreme North Industrial City. Other places were not hit by missiles. It was estimated that regions further east, such as Skaro City and Xianja City, were beyond the range of Blackbird's cruise missiles. As for places in the Biking Valley region, where the population was sparse, there was no point in bombing farmland with missiles. Areas in Central Province, Jeoda Province, and Central North Province, although some had industrial value and absolutely no air defense forces, the industrial distribution was scattered and intelligence was unclear, so it was not cost-effective to bomb them, and they were not attacked. Wixing City and Revival City faced the highest frequency of attacks, but most missiles headed their way were intercepted, especially Wixing City, which wasn't hit again after Gu Heng personally went there to help intercept the missiles that the reflector air defense system failed to block. However, when he went to Wixing City, Revival City became unlucky, and despite the bombardment in several waves, a few missiles still fell, hitting blocks, residential areas, and factories. But all in all, the loss was still relatively controllable. Air raid warnings were sounded over both cities early on, with evacuations where needed, and those who could stay home did so. Even if some residential areas suffered war damage, destroying 2 buildings, casualties were kept under 50 people. The worst situations were in Baegu City, Jeoda City, and Baigong City. Although Baigong City had some air defense systems left over from the Extreme North Industry Group, they were certainly not comparable to the reflector in quality, and the interception efficiency was not very good. As for Baegu and Jeoda, they lacked any air defense systems at all and were purely subjected to the bombing. According to post-attack statistics, these 3 cities, hit by dozens of missiles, had a total of over 5,000 casualties. This was after every city that raised an alarm after the first wave of missile strikes had evacuated people, ceased production and hidden in bomb shelters if they could, or shivered at home if they couldn't. Despite that, the casualty toll was still heavy for the alliance. Current preliminary, rough estimates indicated losses totaling millions tax currency, from population to buildings to industry to goods. Gu Heng was deeply pained by this. What he found most distressing was the loss of population. With 5,000 casualties, even if more than 3,000 were only injured and at least half of them could, after some time of medical assistance, eventually recover their ability to work, it was still a huge loss. But he nonetheless had to be grateful that the Star Warriors had done an outstanding job. In the shortest time possible, they had eliminated the threat of Blackbird's intercontinental ballistic missiles to the Alliance. The bombardment from 500 missiles had resulted in a loss of 1 million tax currency. Of course, Blackbird's ammunition reserves were far more than that. If they really let that number multiply by 10, then a loss in the tens of millions would be inevitable. Baegu City was the capital of the Biking Valley province, an important hub for food processing and distribution in the Alliance. Jeoda City was a significant base for resource collection and primary processing, and also an energy base. Just the destructive attacks on these 2 places alone resulted in losses far exceeding 10 million, not to mention that Baigong City, having inherited the assets of the Extreme North Industry, was nearly the Alliance's second largest industrial center. It could be said that the Star Warriors' sortie had saved the Alliance at least 20 million tax currency in losses and saved countless lives. This incident also served as a wake-up call to Gu Heng and provided a profound lesson for the Alliance. Under his directive, Wixing City had already begun to focus on expanding the production lines of the reflector. 4 models, vehicle-mounted, air defense, naval gun, and orbital, all were to be scheduled for production. The models were arranged from smallest to largest. The vehicle-mounted model was already in mass production, used on Lion tanks and Wind Falcons. The air defense model had previously been produced in small quantities, but now production had to be ramped up. The naval gun model was also entering production, needed for the future Voyager ships of the Alliance, even if these ships didn't even qualify as patrol vessels, but at least they could be equipped with one naval gun-type reflector. The orbital model was both for ground-based anti-orbit warfare, capable of shooting laser cannons from the ground into space, giving the Alliance a means to respond to orbital strikes in the future, and for construction on starports, transforming them into armed star fortresses. Even Tadeus had already received a task from Gu Heng to start preparing a cover for the Alliance's whole orbital air defense system, primarily relying on the reflector. Chapter 476. And right now, the Alliance isn't just taking hits from Blackbird without fighting back, they've made an equivalent retaliation. The Blade Tiger spent a whole day bombarding Blackbird City from orbit until they ran out of ammunition, and only then did they cease. Blackbird isn't like the missile silos the Alliance targets. They have no countermeasures against orbital bombardment. They neither possess anti-orbital firepower capable of exchanging blows with the Blade Tiger, nor the ability to deploy an elite land force to board the starship. So, they just had to endure the bombing. It's a pity that it's the Blade Tiger, not the Quintet, otherwise, the damage to Blackbird City wouldn't be limited to the outer city. The entire core city would be blasted to ruins, and energy shields would be useless. But it's okay if they can't blast it to ruins at once. They can always resupply ammunition and continue bombing a few days later. Some of the larger shells, like the Wrath of Loyalty and Heat Hammer used to be on the Quintet, are beyond the Alliance's manufacturing capabilities. But reflector and defender types are no problem at all. Especially the reflector. The reflector on the Blade Tiger is a shipborne weapon, but its technology specifications are standard. The Alliance is fully capable of supplying the Blade Tiger with high-quality energy cells, allowing them to continue the bombardment unreservedly. What does it matter if the core area survives? There's a Blade Tiger flying in orbit. If they detect a large-scale transport of materials going out, then bomb it. If they detect the enemy's frontline troops amassing, then bomb it. With the orbital advantage on our side, the war becomes much easier to fight. In fact, the war at the front lines had officially begun. The Alliance's army had already encountered the enemy's vanguard in the desert. However, up to now, the scale of the battle hasn't been large. The Alliance's 250,000-strong army had already established a long, south-to-north defensive line in the desert. The entire western desert region, stretching from the sea on the west side of Green Valley in the south to the northern sea in the north, spans a great distance. Just 250,000 soldiers are insufficient to cover such a massive defensive line. If they attempted to do so, spreading the forces too thinly across such a vast expanse would be disadvantageous, and the terrible roads would spell disaster for the Alliance's logistic supply line. Under this premise, Major General Yan Fangxiu, the highest commander at the front line, adopted a comprehensive guard, key defense strategy. The so-called comprehensive guard involved deploying a large number of dispersed small units patrolling in vehicles, along with establishing numerous outposts, which covered a decent area. Coupled with the airborne brothers piloting the Wind Falcons on all-weather patrol and reconnaissance, the hope was to prevent the enemy from crossing the defense line. The so-called key defense referred to concentrating forces primarily along the Western Desert Avenue, partitioned into multi-tiered, layered defensive lines constructed by multiple divisions, controlling the area with key points. Using this method, Yan Fangxiu controlled the 3,000-kilometer-long north-to-south defensive line with 26 divisions, totaling 250,000 soldiers. The key points were on the main artery of the Desert Avenue and several north-south oases. As for the extremities and the vast desert areas of the 3,000-kilometer vertical line, they had to rely on the Air Force and patrol teams. This meant the control was certainly weak, but Yan Fangxiu had no other choice. Compared to the area he needed to control, he simply didn't have enough troops. And more importantly, according to intelligence gathered from behind enemy lines and combined with cross-border reconnaissance by the Air Force, Yan Fangxiu realized the enemy didn't seem to adopt the tactics of massing heavy troops for a focused breakthrough. Instead, the enemy was dispersed into many small units, seemingly attempting to infiltrate and interpenetrate along the 3,000-kilometer defensive line. No matter if the Blackbird's Mechanical Legion intended to penetrate directly to the Alliance's heartland during their interpenetration, or if they planned to engage in surrounding and annihilating tactics in the western desert environment, they must not be allowed to succeed. For this reason, Yan Fangxiu had to adopt this strategy to respond, and both parties gradually began to sink into the quagmire of small-scale warfare. By itself, the scale of the battles was not large, mainly at the squad and platoon level, with the highest going up to the company level. However, the frequency of these battles was quite high, and once real combat ensued, the loss of personnel and equipment was by no means trivial. Yan Fangxiu was getting a bit overwhelmed by the situation. He was planning a major operation. The Central Group Army Political Commissar, Michael Nelson, who held the rank of brigadier, asked Yan Fangxiu with deep concern, "Isn't this a bit too aggressive? Didn't the governor's explicit orders require us to adopt a defensive stance as long as the flames of war do not reach the homeland of the Alliance? And now you are ordering our troops to launch a full-scale offensive to the west, and you also want the Wind Extinguishing Brigade to form an armored cluster to advance 300 kilometers within 2 days." As Nelson questioned, his gaze never left the phantom sandbox that lay before him and Yan Fangxiu. This phantom sandbox was a high-end device, imported through the GU commercial firm by the governor. After inputting parameters, multiple servo skulls computed the data and, through special imaging technology, displayed three-dimensional images of the battle map at different scales, supporting magnification and reduction. On the phantom sandbox, nearly the entire western desert region and the western part of the North Territory was covered, from the southern Gulf to the northern cliffs of the Straits. The information of the Alliance's troops was also fully reflected here, turned into little figures, vehicles, tanks, each with the unit's number flag inserted on top. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the formation, there were row upon row of red flags, symbolizing the enemy forces. This information was not updated in real time, instead, it depended on the staff team summarizing various data sent back from the front line in accordance with specific technical rules and inputting them into the system. As for intelligence on the enemy, it had to be gathered using various reconnaissance methods. It was neither completely reliable nor was it possible to know the enemy's exact unit numbers, so it was necessary to come up with a code name and mark the approximate strength and composition of the enemy's forces. Currently, on this phantom sandbox, a dense mass of offensive arrows had already been drawn. These arrows represented Yan Fangxiu's plan. Almost all division and brigade level units had orders to advance. Among them, the most extreme were the 1st Brigade, the 3rd Brigade, and the 46th and 47th Brigades, which formed an armoured cluster on the western desert avenue, intending to push 300 kilometers westward through countless red flags, ultimately reaching an oasis called Scorpion's Tail. There, it was claimed to be a key logistics supply hub for the Blackbird Army. The Blackbird's cyborgs, mechanical dogs, drones, unmanned combat vehicles, unmanned artillery, these things didn't need to eat, but resupplying ammunition was still essential. Moreover, their demand for fuel, electricity, and other energy supplies for logistics was much higher than that of human troops. Destroying the enemy's reserves in this respect could indeed greatly reduce the difficulty of combat, amounting to a glorious victory. But the difficulty was also too high. Nelson was somewhat hesitant. Yet Yan Fangxiu had his own set of opinions about this. "You're right. The governor indeed ordered us to defend, but Nelson, we need to look beyond the surface to see the essence. What is the purpose of the governor asking us to keep a defensive position? He hopes that before the Star Realm army arrives, we must control our losses in the independent combat against Blackbird, allowing the Star Realm army to take over and solve the problem later, not that we should keep defending forever. But now, the situation obviously does not support us doing so. Those metal monsters dare not engage us in a decisive battle as a group, they have even released control of the Desert Avenue, turning to small unit infiltration and interdiction. To stop them, our warriors have also split into small units and fought bloody battles with them in the desert, one after another. This is not our strength at all. In the past half a month, we've lost over 4,000 people. We can't keep bleeding like this. We must land a heavy blow if we are to keep defending." Chapter 477. Yan Fangxiu's words left his political commissar, Nelson, speechless. The casualty report was updated daily, and Nelson could see it too. Those numbers were absolutely horrifying in his eyes. The battle damage ratio produced by the Alliance looked very favorable. Against those mechanical monsters, the soldiers of the Alliance could achieve an exchange ratio of 1 to 3, or even 1 to 4. But, regrettably, the Alliance had only an army of 250,000, almost the entire mobilizable force of the whole Alliance. In comparison, their enemies were seemingly endless. Although the cyborgs needed to be mechanically modified from the civilians in the west of the mainland, mechanical dogs, drones, unmanned tanks, all required industrial capacity for manufacturing. Regardless of the manufacturing process, difficulty, or cycle, the cost of producing a machine was clearly established. But every soldier of the Alliance needed a mother to carry them for 10 months and then grow up for another 10 or 20 years. This simply couldn't be measured from the same perspective. We can request support from the Imperial Navy. The Blade Tiger can use an orbital strike to bomb the enemy's logistical hub and achieve the same objectives. Nelson was still pallidly making some counter-arguments, attempting to dismiss Yan Fangxiu's plan from other aspects. But in fact, he couldn't even fully convince himself. Because deep down, he actually agreed with what Yan Fangxiu was saying. Sure enough, as the conversation went on, Yan Fangxiu just added one more reason, which finally made Nelson give up resisting. Just bombing alone cannot solve all the problems. The Blade Tiger's firepower has its limits in terms of coverage area, and at the logistical center centered around Scorpion Tail Oasis, our intelligence officers have reported back that all logistical supply points there are camouflaged and dispersed, making the conditions for orbital bombardment extremely poor. Bombing for an entire day might not yield any significant results. Our intelligence officers do not have an easy time surviving behind enemy lines. They can't possibly have the conditions to investigate every supply distribution point to distinguish the real from the fake. Being able to outline the approximate areas is already quite commendable. That's not the job of the Imperial Navy, nor the Allied Air Force. They can't do this, only we can. Only our most valiant warriors can carve out a broad road with a torrent of steel and a surge of artillery fire, marching right into the face of the enemy. By then, the mechanical monsters' logistical supplies, whether dispersed or camouflaged, will be unable to hide from us. After hearing all this, what more could Nelson say? In the end, all he could do was sigh heavily and tragically choose to sign his name on Yan Fangxiu's plan. Then, he went out eagerly to assemble the troops. Watching his retreating figure, Yan Fangxiu smiled silently and helplessly. He was actually very clear about the morale of the entire army. From generals to officers, and then to the ordinary non-commissioned officers and soldiers, the alliance had fought many wars, big and small, since its establishment, achieving victory every time. Victory nurtured the warriors' mindset, allowing them to fear no hardship, believing in the significance of their sacrifices, trusting that victory would eventually arrive, but it also bred a group of arrogant and fierce warriors. Over the past half-month, they had grown thoroughly tired of engaging in small-scale combats with those mechanical monsters. Although they were always able to gain the upper hand, this was not the certainty of victory they desired. The strongest weapons in the soldiers' hands, steel and discipline, couldn't be maximized in such battles. They could neither drive the powerful steel chariots, forming a torrent that would overwhelm the enemy, nor could they rely on steel-like will and discipline to fight the enemy on a large-scale battlefield, battling at the front lines within the firing range of cannons. Now, they could only split into small groups and engage in limited combat with those mechanical monsters, which was truly pitting flesh and blood against steel. Feeling stifled was quite normal. The warriors needed an opportunity for a frontal assault, to vent this repressed frustration. The morale was high, and there was indeed a strategic need, hence Yan Fangxiu proposed such a grand strategy. He made a backup of the relevant documents and then boarded the Wind Falcon returning to Revival City. At the appointed time, he reported to Mr. Gu. Such a significant matter obviously required reporting. Although, when previously receiving his appointment, Mr. Gu made it clear that he was the highest-ranking person in charge of the Alliance Army on the Western Front and had full command authority over strategy. This symbolized Mr. Gu's trust, but Yan Fangxiu couldn't really take advantage of it irresponsibly. How to fight, the specifics of tactical arrangements, these of course were not Mr. Gu's concern. However, the core question of whether to fight or not was something he couldn't decide lightly on his own. He must obtain explicit authorization. This presentation in Revival City lasted a full hour and a half, and he spoke with a tinge of nervousness. No matter how solid his reasons were, it was indeed a strategic approach contrary to Mr. Gu's initial plan, and he also feared that Mr. Gu would be displeased, deny approval, and reprimand him severely. But none of that happened. Even the operation codename was left unattended, as Mr. Gu simply signed the document titled Operation Flashtail with a flourish. Chapter 478. Throughout the process, Mr. Gu just asked a few questions before nodding, telling Yan Fangxiu to hurry back and prepare the battlefield. As he was leaving, Yan Fangxiu also saw Mr. Gu pulling his old partner Tadeus into a secret room, presumably to discuss logistics support and how to ensure a precise supply of the materials needed for the operation. On the return trip on the Wind Falcon, Yan Fangxiu's resolve became even firmer, feeling that the upcoming operation was even more within grasp. David Valenzuela was a lieutenant in the Central Group Army's 3rd Beast-Slaying Brigade, and the commanding officer of the 9th Company in the 2nd Battalion. 3 days ago, his unit received orders to take part in an operation codenamed Flashtail. At first, he thought it was just a routine operation, but when he and his company boarded their vehicles, he realized it was anything but. The entire brigade had mobilized. And it wasn't just their brigade. Watching the many Lion tanks, armored combat vehicles, and countless trucks towing artillery advancing on the same main road, he realized that this Flashtail operation was meant to be a big deal. He became excited. Finally, he no longer had to control a defense perimeter spanning several kilometers with just one company, deploy numerous patrols, respond to ground patrol support requests sent by the possible enemy spotted from their Air Force brothers, and because of the risk of being lured away, could only send out at most one platoon at a time. Most of the time, these sorties ended in a wild goose chase, and on the rare occasions when they encountered small groups of the enemy, they would return victorious but with some personnel losses on their side. The key issue was the strain on everyone's spirits after being tormented for more than half a month. They launched countless sorties, each time suffering losses with some not coming back. Unable to kick those mechanical monsters in the behind, the company's big guns and support from the artillery brothers in the rear couldn't be used, which left him feeling all dressed up with nowhere to go. Now, at last, they could go out for a big fight. The first day after departure was relatively calm. He heard some things from other brother units marching together and even heard distant artillery fire. Later in the evening, their convoy passed through the ruins of a checkpoint. This seemed to be a defensive point for those steel monsters, but it had already been breached by the armored forces ahead, leaving nothing but debris. It was unclear which division or brigade the Sapper brothers belonged to, but they had already cleared the road, continuing to work on either side of it, apparently to haul the scrap metal back. He heard that the Alliance's research institute needed some samples, and aside from the samples, Valenzuela guessed the remaining parts could probably be recycled as raw materials, too. Overall, the first day's journey was a calm one for his company. They didn't encounter anything significant. During that day, they mostly sat in the vehicle marching, day and night. The soldiers could catch some sleep inside, but the drivers had to take turns driving and had to keep going even at night. Sometimes, driving on the main road was the most comfortable. When the main road was too congested, they had to drive on the rough ground below, which was a bit torturous. The vehicle jolted terribly, the speed had to be dropped to a very low level, and it was impossible for those sitting inside to rest. On the second day, however, the excitement began. Their convoy was targeted by artillery fire. 3 shells fell one after the other near their company. Sitting in the passenger seat of the troop transport truck, Valenzuela saw the shells hit the front side, with flying sand and clay smearing all over the vehicle's windshield, while the sound of gunfire was accompanied by shock waves that nearly flipped the vehicle over. Luckily, the Alliance's troop transport trucks had been modified and were no longer like the old ones with just a canopy in the back. Now, at the very least, the sides were sealed with steel plates. The shrapnel from the exploding shell didn't hurt anyone. After being shelled, Valenzuela had the soldiers disembark to take cover, even preparing to follow the trajectory of the shells to investigate, but soon new information arrived. Their own artillery unit had already shelled the opposition. Therefore, they continued to advance and, by evening, entered a battle. It wasn't too difficult. The other brother units under the 4th Infantry Battalion that Yan Fangxiu's company belonged to had already gone up and fought a round. The artillery brothers of the brigade had used thousands of shells to cover their advance. What they had to do was to keep moving forward within 100 meters of the artillery barrage line, keep pushing the line while ensuring the speed of advance, and eliminate the enemies that survived under the barrage. This is called artillery infantry coordination, which is considered a basic operation in the training subjects of the Alliance's army, nothing difficult. The whole battle also had no difficult points. In his view and that of his warriors, it seemed more like a sweep of the battlefield. Most of the work had already been done by the artillery brothers. After returning to their vehicles, they camped in the wilderness. Today, they finally didn't have to travel all night. On the third day, they finally encountered a significant battle. At that time, their convoy had just reached a main road, making the drivers comfortable, and the warriors could finally rest well in the vehicles. Even under the cadence of the company instructor, everyone started singing military songs in the vehicle. But while they were singing, the sound of artillery fire landing came from a place still quite distant in front. The sound was distorted and sounded like muffled thunder. However, the veteran soldiers who had crawled in the battlefield knew that it was the sound of artillery exploding upon impact. Immediately, the atmosphere among the soldiers in the vehicles tensed up, and the singing stopped, as did the clapping. Then, a soldier riding a tricycle motorcycle came towards them with a sign to stop their vehicle, asking them to pull over. The approaching soldier glanced at Yan Fangxiu in the CO pilot seat, quickly saluted upon realizing he was a lieutenant, and said, "Lieutenant Comrade, hello. 10 kilometers ahead, our marching troops have come under artillery fire. This area might become unsafe very soon. I don't know if the enemy's artillery will fire this way. Our commander has sent me to drive eastward and alert the units behind to be aware of the situation. It's best for your unit to stop quickly, get off the main road, and drive into the desert, and spreading out would be better." After finishing his words, the soldier turned to leave, but Yan Fangxiu stopped him. Yan Fangxiu took out a white cigarette pack from his jacket pocket, gave one to the private first class, and then asked, "Which unit are you from? What happened up front? Any specific intelligence you can share?" The private first class hesitated after receiving the cigarette and said, "I'm from the 3rd Battalion of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade. It seems there was an enemy ambush squad that broke through the 47th Brigade's blockade to the south and slipped near the main road. They have self-propelled artillery and caught us by surprise. Our commander is already arranging defense and counterattack. He told me to come here quickly and notify the units behind to be cautious, spread out, and hide." Seeing that the lieutenant in the vehicle seemed to want to ask more, the private first class hurriedly waved his hand, saying, "Don't ask any more, sir, There are still many people I need to notify. I must hurry. Go on, then. The private first class returned to his tricycle motorcycle, sped off towards the east. The sign still on the vehicle and the horn kept blaring. Yan Fangxiu looked away, picked up the handset radio, and barked orders. The entire company got off the main road and moved onto the adjacent bare ground. The whole company, with about a dozen vehicles, indeed spread out to avoid being bombed if it indeed happened. At the same time, he also picked up the handset radio to contact his superiors, inquiring if there was any specific intelligence. But before he could ask, his communicator rang first. The call was from the battalion staff officer, issuing them an assignment. Our marching column has come under artillery fire. The 2nd Battalion of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade is already starting to counterattack. Command your unit to immediately move 35 kilometers to the southwest, interpose behind the enemy forces, and ensure this enemy group is blocked off, not allowing them to continue to roam. Received. After repeating the order, the vehicle radio was hung up. Yan Fangxiu then picked up the handset radio again, switched to the company's channel, and bellowed, "Brothers! We've got work to do. We're going to cut off those Iron Ghosts' escape route. 35 kilometers, I want us to blitz there in 2 hours. Any problems?" The channel erupted with a cacophony. Chapter 479. Valen Ziuan's 9th platoon needed to cross a 35-kilometer stretch of barren desert within 2 hours, 3 at most, to reach the designated battle location. While there was a relatively ample amount of time, it was still impossible to cover the distance on foot. Loaded down with heavy equipment, they had to drive. He sat in the passenger seat, holding 2 maps in his hands. One was large, the other small. The large one had been drawn before departure, with a large scale, roughly plotting out the route for his platoon only. It was copied from the corps staff during a meeting at the brigade headquarters. The small map, on the other hand, was just created following the large map and scaled down according to the mission briefing given by the Corps Chief of Staff during their recent communication. He examined the maps while directing the driver beside him to adjust their course. Marching in the desert, even with vehicles, was difficult. In the West Desert region, except for the main road that runs east-west which can be considered paved, there were no other roads. What existed were only tracks pressed into the earth by the feet of caravans, hooves of cattle, and the wheels of carts. This made it very difficult to traverse. Although the terrain here could be described as flat and endless, in reality, when driving, all the loose stones, sandy areas and small pits and slopes posed obstacles, severely testing the vehicle's off-road capabilities. Fortunately, the newly equipped Iron Bull 200 military edition of the Alliance represented a significant upgrade over the previous model. Not only was the rear cargo compartment now fully enclosed in metal, but also the vehicle's tires, suspension and various other aspects had been enhanced, especially highlighting its off-road capabilities. Bouncing around was unavoidable, and they couldn't drive too fast, or who knew which pebble under the tires might lead to a puncture at this critical juncture of the mission. That would be disastrous. Even though they had spare tires, changing a tire was still a waste of time and trouble, not to mention the possibility that the spares might not be sufficient. The convoy moved across the desert at a speed of around 25 km per hour, leaving some excess time. Valen Ziuan felt that at this pace, they should be able to reach the destination within the scheduled time. The earlier they arrived, the better. Arriving early and having extra time allowed them to dig a few more foxholes, make them deeper, and hence, make the upcoming battle a bit easier. Being eager for battle did not mean recklessly sacrificing the lives of his brothers when the combat began. During their march, they weren't simply moving blindly. Valen Ziuan had long sent out a reconnaissance squad, driving several tricycles from the platoon to scout to the west. The Alliance's army had already equipped communication devices down to the squad level. The reconnaissance team transmitted a piece of intelligence back every so often. They also encountered scouts from other brother platoons, and based on these reports, as well as the battles scouted ahead, Valen Ziuan roughly pieced together the current situation. The number was unknown, but a significant mechanical legion was under fierce attack by a composite camp of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade. That must be the brigade's second camp, which, after being bombed, was counterattacking amidst the artillery fire. It was definitely not enough just to have their forces, even though they had Lion tanks, armored vehicles and elite infantry, the problem of numbers remained. However, while the front-line assault forces were significantly outnumbered by the enemy, the firepower they wielded was exceedingly fierce. The main source of firepower was the Alliance artillery troops, which were already on the move. It wasn't just the wind-extinguishing brigade's composite camp's artillery units participating in the combat. The brigade's own artillery battalion, any support artillery companies that could reach, even the neighboring 3rd Brigade's artillery all capable of firing were pouring their firepower into that area. The intensity of the artillery support far exceeded the expected scale of the participating troops. Under such artillery cover, the progress made by the neighboring 2nd camp was formidable. Valenzuela actually felt a sense of urgency. After calculating the remaining distance and time, he knew they could definitely reach the designated location in 2 hours, but they still needed to get there as early as possible. Rushing, whether in haste or leisurely, they arrived at the predetermined battle location about an hour and a half after departure. The enemy had not arrived yet. They hurried to set up their positions. In theory, they had about an hour to establish fortifications. His platoon, with just over 100 people and some engineering equipment, had everything needed including shovels and hammers. Each squad and platoon found suitable locations and began to work. With so few people and only an hour, it was impossible to dig an intricate and fully functional complex of trenches. Bomb shelters, tunnels, bunkers, command posts, rest areas. All these amenities were absent. But it also wasn't possible to stand on the barren ground and exchange fire directly. They would temporarily dig some foxholes, pile up any loose stones that could be found at the front of the holes as cover and firing points. If conditions allowed, they would also dig another hole next to the foxhole, a covered hole to act as a bomb shelter. But this was not easy. The soil of the western desert was not sandy desert, so it wasn't all loose sand. However, the soil structure was still not solid, and digging holes without artificial supports could easily lead to cave-ins. The platoon only had some basic engineering tools at the moment. They didn't have a proper engineer platoon or battalion, which had even recently been equipped with military-grade engineering machinery, making digging such holes challenging. Valenzuela and the platoon instructor walked around to inspect the defenses set up by each team, evaluating the progress of the engineering work. Chapter 480. But just as they were diligently digging holes, something happened. From the northwest direction, there were figures darting about. The soldiers immediately became tense. Their holes weren't finished yet. In fact, there were still 20 minutes to go until the 2-hour mark they were supposed to reach. But on the battlefield, anything unexpected can happen. The enemy won't coordinate with your actions and arrive just when you say. They might have retreated early, or possibly sent out scouts or vanguards to ensure the safety of their rear. The soldiers still had to hurry and get ready for combat, crawling into the unfinished and quite shallow foxholes. Those who really had nowhere to hide could only crouch behind the iron bull trucks. Using vehicles as cover on the battlefield is obviously not a great choice, but if you don't even have this option, you just have to find a spot and lie down. However, what happened next, it's uncertain whether it was a false alarm or the arrival of even worse news. The arrivals were not enemies but allies. Among them were many familiar faces. It was the brother company from next door, 3rd Company of the 2nd Battalion belonging to the 3rd Brigade. About 20 people came over, many of whom were wounded, looking quite battered. From a distance, when Valenzuela saw these guys, a very bad thought crossed his mind. He called out to his brothers to keep doing what they were doing while the company instructor had already led a team to meet them. Valenzuela, with his binoculars in hand, took a look. The voices in the distance couldn't be heard clearly here, but it was visible that there seemed to be some conflict between the two sides. The good-tempered instructor from 9th Company appeared to be furiously scolding something and even drew his pistol and chambered a round. The soldiers on the other side were crestfallen, a few argued back for a moment, but ultimately there was no further commotion. In the end, the instructor and the soldiers of the company escorted this group back. Fortunately, no greater chaos erupted, and it didn't come to the point of disarming those people. Once they brought the people back, the instructor arranged for them to find a spot and temporarily integrated them into an extra squad to dig holes and prepare for battle. Meanwhile, he himself returned to find the company commander to report the situation. Valenzuela asked, "Deserters?" The instructor's face looked a bit grim. He hesitated for a moment, but then chose a different word. More accurately, they should be rooted soldiers. Valenzuela was noncommittal about this. The instructor had softened somewhat. Deserters and rooted soldiers have completely different natures. The former would have to face a military court, or on the front line, any military officer or civil military officer has the authority to execute them summarily. But as for the latter, it was a choice made out of desperation, with no other options. If they were rooted soldiers, then that was still manageable, they could be rallied and used. But if they were deserters, Valenzuela dared not trust these people. If they could desert once, then there could be a second time. At a critical moment in the battle, if a part of his own defense line directly deserted during combat, it could cost the entire company their lives. Observing the company commander's expression, the instructor hastily said, "Really, they are rooted soldiers. Look, there's no officer among those guys, the highest rank is just a sergeant." Afterward, he relayed the intelligence they had gotten from the mouths of these rooted soldiers. Third Company was to the northwest of their current position, and they were assigned a mission similar to 9th Company's, encircling the rear to conduct a blocking battle. But their situation and luck were both quite unfortunate. First, they ran into trouble on the road, encountering a small group of enemies and were forced to dismount and fight. This made them arrive late at the battlefield, and their planned area was too close to the enemy, so they collided with the main enemy force without having time to prepare. According to their story, they were attacked by artillery before even dismounting, with vehicles blown up, a whole truck of people killed. Just after getting out, they had no cover and had to rely on the vehicles to fight the enemy, but with artillery raining down and combat drones striking from the sky, they couldn't hold out, and their firepower points in the company couldn't be deployed, suffering heavy casualties from the start. When the mechanized dogs rushed in, they couldn't stop them. The unit suffered heavy losses, and the remaining people had to fight and run at the same time. We'll not talk about those who died, but the surviving, they all scattered. They now don't even know where their other comrades fled to, even unsure if anyone else survived besides themselves. Valenzuela showed considerable empathy, sympathizing with the plight of Third Company. A battle, being prepared or not, the outcome is drastically different. He stroked his chin and said, "That does indeed sound excusable, but still, to have them join the upcoming battle, we'll need to keep a close watch on their will to fight. I'll keep an eye on them." The rooted soldiers had already arrived, so naturally, the enemy would not be far behind. In fact, just a few minutes later, the scouts on the front line relayed information that they had spotted the enemy presence, and they even shot down 2 combat drones. And soon, those men returned to the ranks as well. There was no need to continue forward to scout, the enemy had arrived. Valenzuela, binoculars in hand, could already see them himself. "Fire!" he ordered. There was no need to wait for the enemy to come closer before firing. This was not an ambush. On this wide, desolate plain, there were no conditions for an ambush. It was best to eliminate the enemy at a long distance and prevent them from getting close. Chapter 481. However, the guns in the hands of ordinary soldiers did not fire. At present, the enemy was still over 3 kilometers away, and firing ordinary rifles at this distance would be purely a waste of bullets. For the moment, the only weapons firing were the mortars owned by companies. The upgraded 80mm mortars had much more firepower than before and hadn't sacrificed much in terms of portability. 5 such mortars, operated by mortar crews, launched a fierce barrage forward. Another weapon that could fire was the heavy explosive rifle. Its effective range completely exceeded 3,000 meters, and at that distance, it still maintained accuracy. It was the humans who couldn't ensure precision. After all, seeing something 3 kilometers away with the naked eye, it's good enough to see a small black dot. But if there were a bunch of small black dots, they would just use the sights on the guns and their training experience to sweep across them. As the infantry unit's heavy firepower rained down, the enemy was indeed thrown into disarray for a moment. It seemed they hadn't expected to encounter such an intense firestorm from an infantry troop. They had just annihilated and defeated the unprepared 3rd Squad. At that time, the warriors of the 3rd Squad hadn't even managed to set up their heavy weapons before they were suddenly thrust into close combat. But now, facing the firepower of a prepared human infantry position, they suffered heavy losses. Valenzuela, lifting binoculars, saw many cyborgs, mechanical dogs, and even another type that had been less common before, machines with 4 mechanized legs that could move sideways like crabs and were equipped with firepower platforms were also blown apart by a burst of heavy explosive rounds. Company Commander Valenzuela wore a faint smile. Seizing the initiative was quite important, at least it had stirred up the morale of the troops. But soon, the enemy's counterattack arrived. Whistling through the sky, artillery shells approached. The shells were launched from beyond where eyes could see, definitely from a position they couldn't retaliate against. The enemy also had large caliber, self-propelled heavy artillery that could hit targets tens of kilometers away, with firepower at least as devastating as the Alliance's 155mm howitzers. As these shells fell, they struck 9th Squad's position, raising dust and dirt in an instant. Upon hearing the whistling of incoming artillery, Valenzuela shouted artillery, and then ducked his head, wishing he could bury himself in the foxhole dirt. The intense shaking of the ground, the almost deafening explosion, and the splattering of sand, soil, and pebbles on his helmet and uniform. These were all profoundly shocking. But as soon as the bombardment ended, Valenzuela immediately raised his head and surveyed the area. The damage was difficult to assess. One bull vehicle had been flipped by the explosion, and the other foxholes were still with no one popping up their heads, so their condition was unknown. But he clearly saw, at the position where the heavy explosive rifle had been mounted, the bodies of the original gunner and ammunition feeder twisted unnaturally, obviously dead. Looking further ahead, the mechanical beasts that had been previously suppressed by the firepower had taken the opportunity to charge. He gritted his teeth, yanked a nearby warrior, and dashed out, crouching low. He took control of the explosive rifle while the somewhat dazed young warrior he dragged over helped him to feed ammunition. Fortunately, the heavy explosive rifle itself was relatively sturdy, and the artillery shell hadn't landed directly in the foxhole. The gun was still usable. With some operations, he made the explosive rifle roar again. Chapter 482. While the artillery bombardment raged, those mechanical monsters had already charged a great distance within minutes. With the firepower on the 9th Company positions temporarily extinguished, their movement speed was incredibly fast. But once the heavy bomb gun in Valenzuela's hands roared to life again, those charging mechanical beasts suffered a severe blow. The loyal heavy bomb gun, its power to be trusted. Targets directly hit stood no chance of survival. Cyborgs and mechanical dogs, light units like these, would be shattered to pieces upon taking a single hit. This isn't an adjective, it is indeed literally being pulverized by the explosion of the heavy bomb, the power absolutely excessive. Even the large combat machines called crabs by the Alliance, with their 4 legs, standing 2.5 meters tall, armed with machine guns and mortars on their firing platforms, would be doomed after taking 2 shots. Their thin armor couldn't withstand a burst from the heavy bomb gun. Composite armor-piercing warheads would penetrate and explode within, and it only took 2 shots to blast 2 large holes into a crab, immediately paralyzing it. Among the enemy forces, the few unmanned Challenger tanks, they too couldn't withstand the heavy bomb. Although, the Challengers used by Blackbird himself were much stronger than the castrated export version they had sold to the old Alliance, perhaps ordinary bomb guns couldn't break through, but heavy bombs were a different matter altogether. One of them took 3 heavy bomb hits, resulting in 3 holes and an internal explosion. The Challengers had no drivers, so there was no chance of drivers being eliminated by the explosion, halting tank operations. However, one of these 3 bombs either hit the power system or control system, causing an explosion that had a devastating impact on the tank. And all of these were threats caused by direct hits from heavy bombs. Even if the heavy bomb didn't hit directly, it still posed a significant threat. Exploding in the air upon sensing a target, the blast's force was at least 3 times that of a regular bomb gun. The blast wave and the shrapnel would wound or kill light units such as cyborgs and mechanical dogs within a 3 to 5 meter radius. Just the roar of a heavy bomb gun, roaring to life once more, was enough to push back the charging enemies. This weapon was amongst the most expensive and powerful issued to the infantry units of the Alliance. Its cost was even much higher than regular heavy artillery and its range was relatively shorter, but within its operational range, it lived up to its price and quickly became the core tactical weapon at the company level after being distributed among the troops. At this moment, the roar of the heavy bombs became a trumpet-like presence. Warriors, who had ducked their heads during the previous shelling, now poked out and began their violent assault on the enemy. Suddenly, a large number of enemies were suppressed, unable to advance further. But the enemy numbers far surpassed theirs, they would not retreat easily. Light weapons were hard to utilize, popping up to exchange fire would be disrespectful to the heavy bomb gun, those mechanical beasts wouldn't be that foolish. But other weapons could be effective. Several Challenger tanks were rotating their turrets, they had apparently calculated the trajectory of the heavy bomb gun and locked on roughly to Commander Valenzuela's position. The crabs were doing likewise, their fire platforms' mortars had enough range to reach Valenzuela. Many combat drones, swooping in, their ground attack guns firing down from above, could bypass the foxholes and the cover laid by the engineers next to the heavy bomb gun's position, directly threatening the personnel operating the firearms. Valenzuela, who suddenly became a specific target, almost instantly found himself in extreme danger. But at this time, his mind was incredibly clear. He could not change his position, the heavy bomb gun lacked mobility, too heavy for one man to carry, it required 4 or 5 soldiers to handle. At this time, only counterattack could offer a chance of survival. And even if there was no chance, before the end, he had to eliminate as many enemies as possible. He accurately identified the greatest threat, the few Challenger tanks, and turned the gun barrel toward the enemy. 2 kilometers away, the tanks were still not very large targets, but the superior performance of the heavy bomb gun ensured that as long as he aimed, he was highly likely to hit. And he didn't need to hit with a single shot, as long as he maintained burst fire, the gun's recoil was transferred to the earth by the support spokes nailed into the ground, and with his tenacious will and arm strength, he kept turning the gun barrel, ensuring that the trajectory of the heavy bombs was spread within the area he intended. One, and then another, 2 Challenger tanks were consecutively destroyed by the heavy bombs. Meanwhile, the soldiers of the company were not just spectating. In the previous bombardment, the entire 9th Company suffered heavy losses. But unlike the 3rd Company, which had collapsed at the first onset, they had managed to dig in, avoiding total annihilation. The survivors, each employing whatever weapons they could, began to return fire. 2 mortars were still firing, squads pulled out rocket launchers, starting to target the distances, a few of the company's sharpshooters, operating newly issued laser guns with scopes, specifically targeted the approaching combat drones. Chapter 483. The battle had reached an incredibly intense state. These mechanical monsters had already suffered devastating losses, and they should have realized that this was not a successful offensive, perhaps retreat would have been the better choice at this moment. But they didn't do so. Or rather, they no longer had the possibility of retreating. Their main forces were still behind, undergoing the fiercest artillery bombardment of the Alliance, facing an assault by an elite composite camp. They were there to secure a retreat path for the main forces. In total, they numbered over 2,000, with drones and tanks, but they were blocked by a small infantry platoon, which was unacceptable. In their combat command logic, this was to be taken down at any cost. Their mission was to break through step by step. Unfortunately, the mission of the 9th Platoon was to intercept the enemy here at all costs. They had done well enough, suddenly engaged in battle and bombarded by a barrage of long-range artillery, after which they still retained their combat effectiveness and even managed to eliminate a large number of the enemy's living forces during an aggressive attack, including 3 tanks. Valenzuela turned the barrel of his gun towards the 4th tank, and its cannon also turned towards him. But he was confident that before the enemy could fire, he would be able to destroy it with a heavy bomb. It was at this moment that the heavy bomb in his hand suddenly extinguished. He glanced sideways and saw that the private who had been reloading his weapon at his side, a recent recruit, had taken several shots to his body and had already stopped breathing. The wounds on his leg, waist, and shoulder were not all incurred at the same time, they must have been there for a while. But during this time, perhaps the noise of the heavy bomb gun had been too loud, for he hadn't heard a cry of pain. It was also possible that the young soldier had indeed made no sound. He had just silently endured the pain and persisted in his task until a combat drone in the sky drove a bullet into his skull, causing his death and ending his duty. With nobody to operate the external hand-cranked ammunition feeder, the string of bullets running out meant no more were loaded onto the chain. Valenzuela's face was grim, showing no panic. In the last moment, he was still thinking of a solution. He planned to load the ammunition chain himself and then call for other warriors to help. However, all these thoughts had not yet translated into action when the tank cannon already aimed at him emitted an orange flame, and a shell came flying at him. The shell exploded next to the protective shield in front of the bomb gun, penetrating it. The destabilized shell, grazing Valenzuela's face, also took half of his head and a shoulder with it. Blood splattered on the heavy bomb gun, his remaining eye blinked twice, but he could do nothing, falling backwards. With the heavy bomb gun extinguished, those cautiously suppressing enemies were able to charge at full speed once again. In a short time, the Challenger tank that had killed Valenzuela, along with its accompanying infantry and mechanical dogs, had come within a few hundred meters of the 9th Platoon's position. At this range, the soldiers' rifles could unleash their full power, but at the same time, the weapons in the hands of the modified men became more deadly, with mechanical dogs breaking rank and sprinting forward, their mounted submachine guns starting to fire. Although at this range the accuracy of the submachine guns was dreadful, the increased density of fire was still troubling for the warriors of the 9th Platoon. The battle on both sides had entered its most fierce phase, with the casualties in the platoon rising significantly. More critically, with the lack of the core firepower of the heavy bomb gun, there was a subtle trend that was becoming hard to withstand. But in the next moment, the bomb gun roared back to life. This time, it was the platoon's instructor who took over. In fact, it wasn't only him. Many soldiers attempted to take control of the heavy bomb gun, but these attempts all failed. At least 4 soldiers had lost their lives in a valiant succession. However, under their cover, the typically gentle instructor managed to rush over. Dragging an injured leg, he vigorously cranked the ammunition feeder, and at this moment, another soldier rushed in. "You fire!" the instructor yelled, his voice already hoarse. The sergeant operating the heavy bomb gun successfully blasted the leading Challenger tank that was charging, avenging their platoon leader. But before they could fire for long, multiple drones attacked. The platoon's sharpshooters, already taxed, shot down several with red laser beams, but one still got close to the heavy bomb gun's point and rained down a burst of submachine gun bullets from above. When the bullets ceased, the 2 men in the foxhole were motionless. Then came the third group to take over. But this third group hadn't fired many rounds before the mechanical monsters seemed to lose their patience. New whistling sounds came from the sky, signaling yet another barrage from enemy artillery positions at least a dozen kilometers away. And this time, the duration of the bombardment was particularly long, and the number of shells dropped was particularly high. After the explosions, the entire position of the 9th platoon fell silent. The foxhole that housed the heavy bomb gun, the tactical core of the platoon, had been filled with bodies, but the bomb gun that should have been fixed in place was still there. The metal shield in front of it was severely deformed, its stand was skewed, but it itself remained intact, only now it was stained with the blood of who knows how many. Chapter 484. After the artillery barrage ended, the mechanical soldiers resumed their advance. For a long while, no gunfire came from the human soldiers' position. But their movement was still cautious. To take down this position, the mech assault team of over 2,000 had already lost more than a third of their number. Originally there were 6 Challenger tanks, but now only 1 remained. The cost of victory was so great. No, victory had not yet been achieved. When the first few mechanical hounds rushed forward and got within 100 meters of the position, the familiar sound of heavy explosives burst forth again. From the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Company's disintegrated troops, Sergeant Demetrio manned the miraculously undamaged heavy explosive weapon, not only wiping out the advancing mechanical dogs but also blowing up the last Challenger tank. Demetrio didn't know where he found the courage. Earlier, when the 3rd Company had been breached, they were sent scurrying in all directions, only managing to flee. After being stopped by the 9th Company, they were almost mistaken for deserters. His morale, and that of the dozen or so other defeated soldiers, was very low at that time. The panic of a narrow escape, the confusion of not knowing what lay ahead, filled their hearts. They had seen with their own eyes the enormous numbers of the Mechanical Legion paving a way to the rear. He didn't think the 9th Company could hold off these enemies, especially since the enemy not only outstripped them in numbers 20-fold but also had support from long-range artillery. How could this battle be fought? He didn't run, purely because running would mean being executed as a deserter. The subsequent development of the battle didn't exceed his expectations. The 9th Company fought tenaciously, almost exhausting every method to battle those mechanical monsters, but the gap in firepower and numbers still led them to inevitable defeat. But Demetrio saw what happened at the explosive cannon position. When the machine gunner died, the company commander took over. When the company commander fell, the political officer took up the position. When the political officer died, more soldiers rushed forward. This kind of successive bravery deeply moved Demetrio. He couldn't help but think of his own company. If the 3rd Company hadn't been attacked and had persisted in the fight, would the same thing have happened? His company commander, his political officer, and even himself, would they make the same choices as the brothers from the 9th Company? He asked himself this question in his heart. He hadn't found the answer yet, but his body had moved ahead of his thoughts. His actions were slow, yet resolute. Crawling, he made his way to that foxhole. There was no room left to stand, as the small pit was stacked with a dozen bodies. When he regained his senses, he found himself lying on the bodies of the brothers from the 9th Company, his hand on the trigger of the explosive cannon. The ammo feeder was nowhere to be found, but the chain of ammunition in front of him stretched out more than half a meter long. His mind was blank, yet instinctively he raised the gun towards the mechanical hounds, towards the approaching Challenger, and pulled the trigger. The faithful explosive cannon still operated, the gun's barrage tore through the air, the sound thunderous. The sound of the explosive cannon seemed like a catalyst, and at that moment Demetrio's blood also boiled with the gunfire. He couldn't help but roar, venting his emotions. Fear, pain, bewilderment, all of it transformed into bullets heading towards the enemy. In the midst of gunfire, he understood at last. He was going to die, but he felt it was worth it. Chapter 485. Who are you? Which unit are you from? Gorky Dimitrov, Sergeant, from the 2nd Group 3rd Company of the 3rd Brigade. Shouldn't this be the position of the 9th Company? Where are the others from your 3rd Company? These are all people from the 9th Company. Those from our 3rd Company, they are dead over there. I'm sorry, we came late, but we will avenge you. If possible, please take me with you. Faced with the request from the comrade in front of him, Major Roldelou felt somewhat troubled. He was the commanding officer of the 47th Brigade 5th Composite Battalion, and the troops he led were carrying out an encirclement mission. Compared to the previously engaged units, the intelligence he now had was relatively complete. The Mechanical Legion of the Alliance Army, which had broken through from the south, bypassed the defense line of the 47th Brigade and attacked the Alliance troops advancing along Western Desert Avenue, with a possible total number of about 15,000. They were fully equipped with various types of gear, ample armored force, and a large amount of accompanying mechanized self-propelled artillery. Their attack brought significant losses to the Alliance units advancing along the avenue. But the Alliance army swiftly responded, not only launching a counterattack but also planning to move troops and set up an encirclement to trap the enemy. If you dare to attack us, then don't expect a single one of you to escape. The troops of Wind Extinguishing Brigade and Beast Slaughter Brigade carried out the first wave of strategy. Heavy artillery and armored units were thrown into the front lines, while the 2nd Infantry Regiment of Beast Slaughter Brigade split off many companies to outflank the Mechanical Legion to the south, intending to completely enclose them. But soon, the situation took a turn for the worse. The companies of the 2nd Regiment were supposed to establish numerous point defense positions, not too far from each other. The orders received by all units were commonly to reach the designated targets within 2 hours to start constructing defenses. Beyond those 2 hours, the Alliance Staff Department estimated they would have at least half a day to a full day to reinforce their positions. The forces under Major Deliou's command were there to participate in the encirclement. If the encirclement plan went smoothly, they would launch a fierce attack on the Mechanical Legion from the south, forming a pincer attack with the Wind Extinguishing Brigade in the north. If not, they could also help the Beast Slaughter Brigade's 2nd Regiment to block the southern escape route of the Mechanical Legion. But this elite Mechanical Legion reacted much faster than anticipated. Those iron beings, realizing the danger, quickly dispatched vanguard units to ensure that their path of retreat to the south was secure. This was normal, but what was not normal was the number of troops they sent out as the vanguard, far exceeding the original estimates of the Staff Department. They even moved a considerable part of the heavy artillery originally supporting the frontal battlefield to attack the infantry companies that were encircling them from behind. Now, the troops of the 2nd Regiment of the Beast Slaughter Brigade were suffering. The fates of the 3rd and 9th Companies were a microcosm of this problem. They weren't the only ones with problems, several other companies' positions were subjected to fierce attacks, each with various degrees of casualties. However, the 3rd and 9th Companies were the worst hit, nearly wiped out. Major Deliou was filled with a deep sense of shame. His unit arrived just as those mechanical monstrosities launched their final assault. They had already conducted reconnaissance in advance and found out about the battle situation here. The artillery companies within the composite battalion deployed their artillery positions and opened fire on the enemy. The 2 quickest mechanized infantry companies came speeding through the wilderness. But they were still one step too late. By the time their artillery showed their might, the enemy had already started their final assault. By the time the Strider armored vehicles were in position, the enemies, realizing they couldn't break through, retreated like the tide. And in the positions, they found only one survivor, a sergeant from the 2nd Regiment of the Beast Slaughter Brigade's 3rd Company, who had fought at the position of the 9th Company. Faced with the sergeant who wanted to join their operations, Major Deliou, after much hesitation, still chose to refuse. Officially, the refusal was that it was against the rules, and Sergeant Dimitrov should report to his own unit and convey the events that happened here to his superiors. But, in truth, a more significant reason was guilt. Apart from feeling guilty for arriving late, there was another core element. The 47th Brigade, supposed to be guarding the south and blocking the southern enemy, had allowed such a large wave of the Mechanical Legion in, clearly indicating a major mistake. Whether it was a mishap or a question of capability, ultimately, it was their failure that led the brother units in the middle to be suddenly attacked and to have to defend their positions against such a large numerical difference. The forces belonging to Major Delu, heading north to participate in the encirclement, were merely closing the stable door after the horse had bolted. Perhaps, for the overall state of the war, their northward action was not too late, but for the 3rd and 9th Companies, it was already too late. Under these circumstances, how could he have the heart to let Dimitrov follow along? If the only remaining survivor of these 2 companies were to also perish in subsequent combat, he would feel guilty unto death. The warriors of the 475th Battalion, upon seeing the condition of the 9th Company's position, felt much the same as their commanding officer. In their shame, they kindled raging fury. To wash away the dishonor, only the enemy's remains would suffice. After bidding farewell to Dimitrov, the 900 warriors of the 475th Battalion continued northward. 3 hours later, they received orders from the command, requesting them to launch an attack on the enemy. Chapter 486. Hence, Lion tanks, Strider combat vehicles, and 155 towed artillery simultaneously poured the warriors' fury upon the heads of those mechanical monsters. They had to vent their shame in this manner. On the flat terrain of the battlefield, the armored troops deployed massively. Artillery had already stopped far behind, and 12 heavy guns began to fire in the direction of the armored troops' assault. Roughly every 2 minutes, a barrage of 100 shells was unleashed, and the 475th Battalion's ammunition reserves were enough to sustain this rate of fire for 20 minutes. Following the barrage, Lion tanks at the forefront kept firing their cannons, while the coaxial machine guns swept fire madly. Charging alongside the tanks were the infantry fighting vehicles, whose autocannons couldn't penetrate the opposing tank's armor, but were deadly against other units. Their mounted machine guns could also elevate to engage flying drones. Not to mention, interspersed among them were several anti-aircraft vehicles, specially equipped with anti-aircraft guns and fire control systems that were more effective against drones. And the enemy was clearly not well prepared in the south. The troops on the defensive line seemed to be the same mechanical units that had attacked the 9th Company's positions, resulting in a loss of more than a third of their forces and most of their Challenger tanks abandoned. Under the retaliation from the 475th Battalion, they were utterly powerless. After being bombed, followed by a charge from the armored troops, the entire defensive line was breached. Then the infantry that came up after cleared out any remaining enemies, and almost without resistance, the entire situation tilted completely in favor of Major Delu. Afterwards, the troops continued forward, coming across the enemy's main artillery position. There, at least 100 self-propelled artillery pieces were aimed northward. What other outcome could there be when the artillery position was pierced right in the rear by the armored troops? The whole unmanned self-propelled artillery position was utterly dismantled within half an hour, not a single artillery piece escaped. At the Alliance Field Command, a dozen or so officers converged. They had just received the latest intelligence, the battle at the front had largely ended, and the Alliance Army naturally achieved the final victory. The breakthrough from the southern front, attacking the Mechanical Legion on the western desert avenue, had been annihilated. All 15,000 mechanical units were completely destroyed here. The situation was settled. This settlement referred not only to the current battle, but the entire flash tail operation could be considered as part of it. According to the Alliance's reconnaissance information, the last mobile force that Blackbird Heavy Industries could muster and deploy along the entire line of defense was already there. This of course did not mean that the loss of more than 15,000 mechanical units was a significant blow to Blackbird Heavy Industries. Nevertheless, the 400,000 units Blackbird had deployed on the front line were also scattered over 1,000 kilometers of the front, spread quite thinly. When the Alliance pinpointed a section and launched the flash tail operation, creating a huge salient 300 kilometers deep in just 3 days, Blackbird could muster only so many troops in the surrounding area in a short time. There were, of course, other units, whether elsewhere on the front lines or in the rear, but they could not fly over. Here, there were no more. With these 15,000 enemies gone, Blackbird no longer had the capability to redeploy forces in the short term. This also meant that the nearly 300-kilometer deep salient formed by the Wind Extinguishing Brigade, the Beast Slaughter Brigade, the 47th and 48th Brigades, was now secure, with no further threats. Under their assault, their target, namely the enemy's logistical assembly base centered on Scorpion Tail Oasis, had been completely exposed. It was estimated that in no more than 3 days, they would achieve their intended combat objective, the complete destruction of the enemy's logistics support base. Ammunition, batteries, fuel. With these destroyed, armies composed purely of mechanical units faced greater struggles and had fewer solutions than human armies. Human troops, without vehicles, without food, could still run on two legs, taking up guns, wielding cannons, relying on their rations and water bottles to continue fighting for another 2 or 3 days. Although this would severely test their morale and the soldiers' tenacity, there were still ways to endure. But mechanical troops are different. Without batteries, without fuel, that's just it. When they're down, completely immobilized. At the end of Operation Flash Tail, after dealing with the enemy's logistical center, there would be some actions left. They'd block the enemy's retreat, sweep the supply lines that the enemy is using from even further back, and other brother units along the entire front would launch attacks, not to annihilate the enemy, but to bite and exhaust. According to estimates, in another 3 days, all the mechanical troops that hadn't managed to retreat would never be able to. Human troops, following up, would then be able to effortlessly capture countless immobile mechanical units along the road and destroy them. In this respect, Operation Flash Tail was exceedingly significant. And now, the first light of victory had already shone down, and logically speaking, the atmosphere in this frontline command post should be very good. But the reality was just the opposite. The dozen or so officers in the command post were all from the 4 brigades involved in the operation. They were either brigade commanders, brigade chiefs of staff, or political commissars, the rank and file of colonel-level officers, with the lowest being a major and most being lieutenant colonels. Normally, there would also be many operational staff members here. They would gather here and, under the supervision of the senior officers of the 4 brigades, work together to coordinate the joint actions of the 4 brigades. Before, this place was busy and meticulous, with intelligence relayed in a simple and efficient manner after communication, and then orders passed down. Now that victory had come, however, those ordinary staff members had all been sent out, leaving only the senior officers of the brigades. The highest commander of the entire operation was without a doubt Major General Yan Fangxiu, the head of the Western War Zone. However, he was not present here but taking command from behind, as even though Operation Flash Tail was important, he still had to carry the command responsibilities for over 20 divisions and brigade-level units in the entire Western War Zone. He couldn't just run to the front line. Thus, under him, the top commander, among the 4 brigades, there was another frontline commander. This person in charge, who also happened to hold the highest rank in the command post, was Colonel Lucy Lee Koxi. There were actually 2 colonels here, with the other being Colonel Danny Doyle's from the Wind Extinguishing Brigade. He took up the position after Prabhup was promoted to Army Group Commander of the Blackbird Expeditionary Force, so he was relatively junior. By contrast, Colonel Lee Kexi's tenure was much longer. Having once been a mercenary wandering around Rubbish Town, he formed the Beast Slaughter Group. When the Alliance gained control of Rubbish Town, he was among the first to pitch in what one might call investing with expertise. Thereafter, based on the former Beast Slaughter Group, the Alliance's 3rd Independent Regiment was formed, which, through solid battle achievements, produced many heroic figures, among which Soldier King Rorschach was the most famous. The regiment, based on its merits, had its special beast slaughter designation restored and was upgraded to the Alliance's 3rd Beast Slaying Brigade. During this process, Lee Kexi himself was promoted 3 times in rank, from major to colonel. However, his position has always been the leader of the Beast Slaughter Brigade. In this campaign, he was appointed by General Yan Fangxiu as the frontline commander, responsible for coordinating the cooperation of the 4 brigade-level units. The other 3 brigades were to respect his opinions and accept his commands. During the previous coordination efforts, Lee Kexi always maintained a calm demeanor. He didn't speak much, and his decisions were decisive when disputes arose. But now, having won the battle, he could no longer suppress his emotions. After sending all the ordinary staff out, he sat in the central position and ranted for over 10 minutes. Everyone silently endured the fury of this old-timer colonel. In this battle, the Beast Slaughter Brigade suffered the heaviest casualties. And the ones he scolded the most fiercely were the 3 officers from the 47th Brigade. Chapter 487. Colonel Lee Kexi certainly had reasons to be angry. Although the Beast Slaughter Brigade had replenished its soldiers, nearly half of its personnel were still from the Beast Slaughter group he had once led. They fought the Greenskins in the ruins, in space, in the south against aberrant beasts and cultists, and during the pacification of the eastern provinces they had quelled the rebels. Every warrior in the Beast Slaughter Brigade was a fine young man. But many of them had died here. The exact, detailed casualty report from this battle hadn't come out yet, but from the current estimates, the total losses of the Alliance army might exceed 3,000, most from the Beast Slaughter Brigade, with the smaller part from the Wind Extinguishing Brigade, and the 47th Brigade suffering very few casualties. Among these losses, nearly a third occurred during an ambush on the Western Desert Avenue, when preparations were inadequate. In battle, another 2/3 were lost under the enemy's full-fledged resistance. Within these losses, the second group of the Beast Slaughter Brigade bore an especially heavy burden. The entire group was almost completely decimated. The second group had only 9 combat companies, and including various other artillery, logistics, sappers, and other support troops in the group headquarters, the total force was just under 1,600 soldiers. Now, they had practically no combat strength left. Situations like the total annihilation experienced by the 3rd and 9th companies were just 2 examples, but other companies also suffered heavy casualties in the fight to block the enemy's retreat to the south. Given the current situation, the whole group needed to return for rest and recuperation, then replenish personnel and equipment before they could restore combat capability. That was no different from having to rebuild the group from scratch. Colonel Lee Kexey truly loved his troops like his own children and couldn't bear to see his soldiers suffer heavy casualties. But he was a military man, a qualified commander, and if victory required the sacrifice of soldiers, he would not hesitate to pay the price. He understood the principle that kindness does not command soldiers. But was the victory they had just achieved really necessary? They had indeed achieved a critical victory, clearing the last obstacle for Operation Swifttail. But, essentially, it was just patching up the mistakes made by the 47th Brigade in the south. If they hadn't erred, this battle wouldn't have been necessary at all. The 15,000 mechanical units, tightly locked down in the south, with the 47th Brigade keeping close watch had they done so, the Alliance army advancing along the Western Desert Avenue could have reached Scorpion Tail Oasis much faster and accomplished the strategic objectives. Even if the Mechanical Legion had fiercely attempted to stop them, whether by directly attacking the 47th Brigade head-on or by circumventing to the west and standing in front of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade and Beast Slaughter Brigade, it would have been a frontal battle. Firstly, there wouldn't have been any surprises like being bombed during a march, and secondly, the warriors of the Beast Slaughter Brigade wouldn't have had to engage in a death match with a far superior enemy force, composed of infantry, armor, and drones, without artillery support and having to dig makeshift defensive positions. It's a critical victory indeed, but it's a war fought reluctantly to make amends for the grave mistake you committed. The sacrifices of the warriors are honorable, and the victories won by the warriors are also honorable, but that does not wash away the disgrace on you. Colonel Lee Kexey continued to berate the lieutenant colonel from the 47th Brigade. The lieutenant colonel, about to drown in Lee's spittle, just hung his head and didn't dare say a word. If his unit had been breached by the enemy in a blood-soaked battle, perhaps he would have had room for argument. But in fact, the enemy hadn't even encountered any battle before they bypassed his defensive line, and he failed to detect it beforehand. It was the Air Force brothers, on their regular patrol, who spotted the situation and issued a warning to the command. Firstly, he should have not let the enemy break through, secondly, he should have not been oblivious to it. And he made both mistakes. Indefensible. In the end, even Colonel Lee Kexey had grown tired of berating him. He said coldly, "I've reported the relevant situation to the headquarters. You just wait for the military tribunal." Colonel Lee Kexey, with the rank of colonel, temporarily taking the duty of frontline commander and in charge of 4 brigades, did not mean he had the authority to dismiss a lieutenant colonel brigade commander. But his mention of going to military court was not just an idle threat. He might not have the power to remove the lieutenant colonel, but Yan Fangxiu did. Soon, a command from the headquarters arrived. The lieutenant colonel leading the 47th Brigade, along with a major who was the chief of staff, were directly dismissed on the spot. The acting brigade commander and the acting chief of staff stepped up. Since both of their ranks and seniority were not quite adequate, the political commissar of the 47th Brigade temporarily took over the command. The 2 relieved of duty were headed east in a car, led by a team of military police, gone without much fanfare. They were to first report to General Yan's headquarters to state their case and provide an opportunity to explain themselves regarding Colonel Lee Kexey's reports. But, there wasn't much room for explanation, and a scolding was inevitable upon arrival. Being scolded was the easy part. After that, they would have to go to Revival City to face the Alliance Military Tribunal. The Alliance Military Tribunal operates independently outside the normal legal system of the Alliance, dedicated to adjudicating active duty military personnel. It is overseen by Major General Tadeus, the chief political commissar, with the help of Grand Judge Lambert. Having studied relevant military regulations and legislation, the one removed from duty probably had a clear idea of what consequences lay ahead. Chapter 488. Life, it wasn't that dire. He hadn't committed the gravest of offences, such as treason, desertion, or disobedience to a superior's orders. Neglect of duty, dereliction of duty, that was the most serious of his charges. And in fact, what happened afterward was not far off from his own judgment. He was stripped of his military post, demoted to the rank of captain, and relegated to a civilian department. Then, 6 months later, he was reassigned to a new unit, serving as a battalion commander in a garrison division in the Green Valley region, dealing daily with the aberrant beasts that still lingered in the southern Green Valley. His competence was certainly there, otherwise, he couldn't have been promoted. After making a serious mistake and taking a major hit, one often grows. Besides, merely serving as a battalion commander in a garrison, his abilities were definitely up to the mark. Surely those aberrant beasts couldn't suddenly grow brains, engage in maneuvers like flanking, reconnaissance, deception in warfare, and bypass his defensive lines, right? Half a month later, Gu Heng in Revival City received a comprehensive report on Operation Flash Tail from Yan Fangxiu. The entire operation had already concluded. And before this battle report had arrived, he had already seen the settlement interface from the system panel. West Desert Campaign Settlement. Epic victory, earned 12,284 points of grace. 17,325 losses, 246,645 enemies annihilated. These figures were quite impressive. Actually, before Operation Flash Tail, the Alliance had already incurred over 13,000 casualties in the full-scale combat, in those fierce battles of infiltration and counter-infiltration. These were substantial losses, especially considering the fighting lasted less than a month. Although the Alliance had also destroyed over 50,000 various mechanical units during this process, this kind of bloodletting warfare was definitely not what the Alliance desired. Exchanging human lives for the wreckage of mechanical units was, in Gu Heng's view, a decidedly losing business. Operation Flash Tail, after Yan Fangxiu had prepared the plan and reported back, was approved by Gu Heng. He too was looking forward to achieving impressive results. Yan Fangxiu, along with a series of commanders on the front lines, did not disappoint his expectations. Despite a few unexpected developments in the middle, the overall strategy proceeded smoothly. After annihilating the enemy's last mobile force that could be deployed, they destroyed the logistical distribution center at Scorpion Tail Oasis. The subsequent developments unfolded just as anticipated. Deprived of batteries, fuel, and other vital resources, the enemy's frontline forces began to collapse. Units with scant reserves perhaps had only 2 to 3 days of combat capability left, while those with more could hold out for no more than 8 to 9 days before being finished. Realizing victory was utterly impossible, they began to retreat indeed. As soon as that last mobile force was annihilated, the puppet masters behind these mechanical monsters had come to this realization and made the worst-case preparations. However, retreating was easier said than done. Merely withdrawing to areas supported by their logistical supplies in the desert required a lengthy journey. Much like human troops venturing deep into the desert, it was the same for the Mechanical Legion, which had a journey of over 1,000 kilometers. Moreover, how could human troops possibly stand by and watch them retreat? In the entire Western War Zone, the Alliance Army commenced a full-scale offensive. Their goal was not to annihilate the enemy but to delay, harass, and encircle. And the 4 brigades that had created a significant bulge, under the command of Colonel Li Kexi, also began to flank the enemy from both sides, cutting off their retreat. On the entire map, it was clearly visible that after these 4 brigades created a large bulge in the front lines, they started side movements like petals blooming to the sides, aiming to sever the enemy's escape routes. Of course, perfection was unattainable. Mechanical units retreating to the rear fought desperately. Their numbers were still not sufficient. If they encountered such units, they would let them pass without resistance. However, if they encountered units with insufficient energy reserves, or those with inadequate troop concentrations, they would decisively intercept them. This form of combat persisted for over 10 days. In the central western desert, on the thousands of kilometers wide north-south front line where the Mechanical Legion fully confronted the Alliance Army, the enemy forces collapsed. On their western retreat, some units were destroyed, others escaped, and the remaining half, running out of energy during the escape or combat, turned into scrap littering the ground, collected effortlessly by the Alliance and, except for some samples, were all destroyed en masse. Even now, the destruction is still ongoing. Blackbird Heavy Industries was even driven out of the West Desert region at one point. Nonetheless, Yan Fangxiu maintained a clear awareness of the situation. He regrouped all his forces and strictly ordered them not to pursue beyond the West Desert region. Indeed, starting from today, the entire Western War Zone had been retracting backward, planning to shrink back to the original front lines. Gu Heng felt regretful about this, but he knew that Yan Fangxiu's decision was correct. Of course, if possible, he also wanted to take advantage of the momentum, march hundreds of thousands of troops westward, and flatten Blackbird. But that was not feasible. Thaddeus issued a warning: our own logistics have also reached their limits. The logistics of the Alliance, which had never been very robust to begin with, relied solely on the lifeline of the Western Desert Avenue. The previous offensives had consumed a large amount of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. At the same time, there were numerous wounded soldiers needing evacuation. Meanwhile, more than 100,000 enemy troops had escaped to the continental west before losing power, where they received reinforcements. Even in various parts of the continental west, there were likely many mechanical units still present. Blackbird Heavy Industries had not collapsed. If the pursuit continued, it was quite possible that they might push back normally. In the face of such risk, it was more sensible to choose stability over making mistakes. Gu Heng could totally understand that point. But to let go of the enemy in this wave was truly regrettable. Gu Heng always believed that one should face the most pessimistic plans with the most optimistic attitude. He estimated that given Blackbird Heavy Industries' degree of rebellion, their recovery would be incredibly rapid. Their production lines were probably already running at full capacity. A large number of mechanical units would come off the assembly line, not needing 9 months of gestation nor military training, and quickly replenish the front lines. In this process, the fastest production speed was likely to be for making mechanical humans using humans as material. This meant a substantial loss of human life. Gu Heng felt very pained about this. But what could the Alliance do? He had already instructed Yan Fangxiu to establish a rescue lifeline along Western Desert Avenue, all the way west, and commanded the intelligence line under Lambert's charge to activate the 200 or 300 intelligence officers who had infiltrated the West. They would proclaim the Alliance's victory, denounce the atrocities of Blackbird Heavy Industries in using humans to manufacture mechanical humans, and announce the existence of a lifeline. Those who were willing could head eastward, and the Alliance Army would coordinate their rescue and help them escape Blackbird Heavy Industries' control. But, this strategy might save some people, but for the entire west of the continent, with over 15 million people, it could not act as a savior. Firstly, the actions of intelligence personnel were limited, they couldn't organize large-scale evacuation efforts. Secondly, the chances of refugees successfully fleeing eastward on their own were low, as mechanical units would continuously patrol, and thirdly, the lifeline established by the Alliance was fragile, only viable during the brief window when Blackbird was heavily damaged. Once Blackbird recovered and the Mechanical Legion resumed positions on the front line, this rescue lifeline would likely break. Chapter 489. The success of Operation Flashtail and the conclusion of the Western Desert Campaign had awarded Gu Heng with over 12,000 points of grace. This amount, in comparison to the number of enemy mechanical units destroyed, was actually a bit meager. However, Gu Heng easily accepted this. For one thing, the growth in the scale of the war and the increase in grace points awarded were not linear, something he had verified through previous experience. Secondly, it seemed to the system that these mechanical units were not very valuable. As of now, Gu Heng had a total of over 16,000 points of grace at his disposal. The additional 3,000 plus points came from the monthly income just dispensed. But he didn't use these points of grace. He had to keep something in reserve. Mainly for if situations worsened later, he needed to have enough grace points to train his troops. 1 point of grace would train a 100-man squad, which once seemed fairly cheap. But now, when the size of the army can easily amount to several hundreds of thousands, the grace points needed for a single training session would start in the thousands. This was already no small sum and could not be ignored. But if he was determined to flatten Blackbird Heavy Industries in the west of the continent with his strength, then such level of expenditure was necessary. Did the Alliance have the capability to push through and level Blackbird Heavy Industries in the west of the continent? Yes, they did. After the issuance of the Level 2 mobilization orders, the Alliance's manpower pool had reached 700,000. This was the number eligible for conscription, not including the 450,000 already in service, with over 200,000 remaining. This was not a potential manpower tally, these over 200,000 people were already registered. Their addresses, occupations, workplaces, names, family situations, the Army's recruitment office was clear about all of these details. The centralized and planned political system of the Alliance demonstrated its tremendous superiority here. If necessary, over 200,000 summons would be sent to these people's homes, and within a week they would all appear in the recruit camps. With the leveling 2 mobilization orders in place, the Alliance's military-industrial production was at full throttle, with the corresponding equipment being produced over time. Gu Hang had nearly 4,000 points of monthly grace points just handed down, and the over 10,000 points of grace he had just settled, all of which he hadn't frivolously used. When necessary, he could surge in troop numbers. Not just these 200,000 plus people, but if necessary, they could enact level 1 mobilization orders, and the reserve forces could directly reach the level of 500,000. Without even discussing higher level mobilization orders, just surging these 200,000 troops to the front line and giving it another month or two for the production of logistical supplies, the Alliance could launch another large-scale campaign somewhat larger than Operation Flash Tail. They could possibly push into the heart of Blackbird territory. But, such an action would certainly result in considerable losses. Deep within the enemy-controlled region, the Alliance's supply lines would be very stretched. Conversely, the enemy fighting on home turf would find resupplying much easier. It would no longer be possible to seize the kind of great chance they had during Operation Flash Tail to engage in large-scale annihilative battles. Indeed, if they really waited for a month to launch such a large-scale offensive, the enemy forces would likely have recovered a great deal. Fortunately, the Blade Tiger in orbit was constantly bombarding the western desert. Although the core area of Blackbird City was enveloped by an energy shield and could not be destroyed, its suburbs had nearly been flattened. Later, through the starport, the Blade Tiger resupplied its ammunition on the surface and resumed the bombardment. This time they circled around the orbit above Blackbird City, dropped a few bombs, found that there was not much left to bomb in the outskirts, and then shifted targets to bomb some high-value targets that had been identified by the Alliance's intelligence officers active in the West Road. They even took the time, during and after Operation Flash Tail, to locate and bomb some of the enemy forces that were retreating and had gathered together. However, the firepower of the Blade Tiger was still somewhat insufficient, and the results of the bombing were just so-so. Objectively speaking, the help was significant. Because, one can't just look at their kill records, one has to consider, for instance, the huge damage to Blackbird Heavy Industries' productivity after bombing Blackbird City. It posed a great threat to Blackbird Heavy Industries' supplies as well, forcing their supply convoys to refrain from transporting troops and materials in large and concentrated groups, or they might get bombed. It also posed a great threat to Blackbird's frontline forces if any Blackbird troops were found assembling in the wilderness, in areas with good visibility, and detected by the Alliance's Air Force. The coordinates would quickly be uploaded, and they would soon be struck by the Blade Tiger. This prevented Blackbird's Mechanical Legion from daring to assemble large forces in advance. Even in assembly, they could not be too dense and had to camouflage as much as possible to avoid detection, to minimize losses if they were bombed. All these indeed caused considerable trouble for Blackbird. But, that was all there was to it. It did not constitute a fatal blow, nor directly tip the scales of victory. Ultimately, the Blade Tiger was not fierce enough, and the help it provided was limited. The main combat still required the bravery of the Alliance's warriors to seize victory. Gu Hang had already prepared for the worst. If it came to it, the Alliance would go all out. For the sake of capturing ultimate victory, they would not hesitate to pay a higher price. But before that, Gu Hang still needed to make one final effort from other aspects. Chapter 490. When will the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion arrive? Gu Hang initiated contact with his mother. Not even in the mood for pleasantries, Gu Hang asked directly, "What exactly did the Fatch's family say? Today is the deadline of the ultimatum. 2 days ago, I asked you to convey my attitude to them, and this is the last time I'm asking this question. I must know what their answer is." Gu Hang expressed his dissatisfaction forcefully. Miss Wang Qi appeared somewhat helpless. Their answer this time is a bit different from the last. Before, they kept saying that the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion was only stationed on 3 of Fatch's planets and that the Fatch's family had no power to deploy this Legion of the Star Realm armed forces, merely saying they would try their best to coordinate, lobby, and strive to send troops. Now, at least they're not giving those excuses anymore and have firmly promised to deploy forces, with no less than 1 million. What is this supposed to mean? What about the timing? Gu Hang immediately interrupted his mother. Although it was impolite, he couldn't help it. They didn't say, my people are still discussing it with them. Ridiculous. Gu Hang angrily made a final demand, if the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion hasn't left Fatch's planets within 10 hours, then I'll take it as a refusal of our goodwill by the Fatch's family. I swear, in the upcoming conflict with Blackbird Heavy Industries, I will certainly find irrefutable evidence of the Fatch's family's full involvement with the Iron Men rebellion. The color drained from Wang Qi's face, and she said in a low voice, isn't this being a bit too aggressive? I've had enough of their evasions and delays. We're not allies with them, but we still informed them immediately of the connection between Blackbird and the Iron Men rebellion, allowing them to avoid being passive. We might even offend the heads at Paydesi because of this. This is a gesture of goodwill from me, from the Gu family. And this is how they repay us. Wang Qi sighed and said firmly, I understand. After ending the call with his mother, Gu Hang then called the head of the military department, Tadeus, and Alliance Premier Ozania, to inform them to be ready with contingency plans. 10 hours wasn't just empty talk or boasting from Gu Hang. If he issued a warning, he naturally had the capability to make it a reality. Blackbird was a Fatch's family enterprise, and their full cooperation was difficult to clean up without Gu Hang's assistance. And if Gu Hang wouldn't cooperate and instead made trouble for them, discovering some special evidence, their trouble would become quite significant. Especially since the Gu family possessed their own political capital, and Paydesi would be more than happy to lend a hand. Moreover, even without the assistance of the Star Realm armed forces, Gu Hang could annihilate Blackbird despite the casualties. It would simply mean escalating the mobilization order to level 1 and reinforcing with more than 400,000. Gu Hang would have to pay 4,000 points of favor to train these 400,000 into qualified soldiers. Apart from training, equipping them with sufficient weaponry would require that the Alliance's industrial power shift completely from civilian to military industry. The contingency plan he tasked Ozania and Tadeus to prepare was exactly this. With this approach, adding the existing forces, it was estimated that Blackbird could be overcome within half a year. There would be a huge number of casualties, not just among the soldiers, but also among the civilian population of the western mainland. Transitioning to military industry on a large scale would also affect the Alliance's industrial development. But if this price had to be paid, then it would be paid. Gu Hang would make sure the Fatch's family paid 10-fold, 100-fold in return. Luckily, this situation did not come to pass. 3 hours later, Miss Wang Qi relayed the latest news to him. Wang Qi had personally communicated with the leader of the Fatch's family, Yvonne Fatches. Besides fully conveying Gu Hang's stance, she also made their position clear as the head of the Gu family, with both a harsh threat and some negotiations of interest. Ultimately, the Fatch's family found themselves with no room left for delay. They promised to comply with Gu Hang's request and, within 10 hours now send the first batch of Star Realm armed forces troops aboard Gu commercial firms' merchant vessels docked at Fatch's 2 starport. Transporting 1 million troops isn't easy. The first contingent to arrive was expected to be over 20 divisions, no fewer than 300,000 troops. They would embark on Gu commercial firms' Jumbelli transport ships, flanked by armed merchant vessels, heading for Rage Owl Star. Hearing this news, Gu Hang breathed a sigh of relief. Good. It seemed the Alliance would not need to issue the Level 1 mobilization order after all. Of course, he didn't cancel the contingency plan immediately. The Fatch's family had a history. Gu Hang needed his mother to give him concrete news. 7 hours later, whether the Star Realm troops had begun boarding or not. If Fatches had deceived him and the matter was still dragging on, then everything would be called off, and Gu Hang would no longer count on additional reinforcements. This time, Fatches had been given ample warning and did not dare to play tricks anymore. In fact, soldiers from the Star Realm army began boarding the starport and entering the transport ships that had been waiting there, just 8 hours after the final warning had been issued. Boarding would take some time, and from the Fatches star system to the Rage Owl star system, the journey also required time. Overall, this first batch of support troops from the Star Realm army would arrive at Rage Owl star in 22 days. This was quite a relief. Gu Hang could finally breathe a sigh of relief and shared this intelligence with Yan Fangxiu, who was commanding the operations in the Western War Zone. Yan Fangxiu was overjoyed. Having strong reinforcements was, of course, very good. If possible, he did not want his own troops to engage in a bloodbath. He made up his mind that, for the next 20 or so days, he would focus on stability, reducing losses as much as possible, and wait for the Star Realm army to arrive before advancing westward. But before the Star Realm army's arrival, Rage Owl Star was to receive a group of other visitors from beyond the heavens. The Imperial Tax Fleet. The time had come for Rage Owl Star to pay its taxes. The problem was that the Imperial tax Rage Owl Star owed this year was still on the Western Front. The Sun Lord's Apostle of War, Bakoya Galaraldo, was aboard a destroyer, carrying a giant belly, en route to the Rage Owl Star system. He stood at the window, having just passed through the vibrant beauty of the Star Realm tunnel, which seemed to linger in his eyes, yet outside the window, the expanse had become an infinite starry sky. Having traversed the Star Realm tunnel, it would only take another day or two to reach Rage Owl Star. I've heard that this Rage Owl Star used to be a very rich resource garden planet. Yes, replied a no-nonsense woman standing next to him. Her name was Nell Lavis, and she was the highest authority of this tax fleet, a senior official of the Imperial Taxation Department overseeing the entire tax affairs of the Dragonhawk Star domain. Her working model involved leading a gigantic tax fleet, escorted by the Dragonhawk fleet, voyaging year-round throughout the 37 star sectors of the whole Dragonhawk Star domain. Circling the route to collect taxes typically took about a year and a half. She needed to calculate the tax collection intervals for each star sector, some being 2 years, others 5, and even 10. Then, after spending 4 months traveling, she would deliver the collected Imperial taxes from the Dragonhawk Star domain to a distribution center designated by the Eastern Cosmic Realm government, the next higher level of administrative authority. These taxes would then be distributed under the directives of the government of Holy Terra, in the human ancestral star's capital, to various places in need. And after delivering the taxes, Lois would immediately head back to the Dragonhawk Star domain and start over by cruising through the 37 star sectors to collect taxes, in an endless cycle. In response to the Apostle of War's question, Lois reminisced briefly, recalling some images, and said, "Indeed, when I had just started as the chief tax administrator of the Dragonhawk Star domain, I came here to collect taxes. It indeed was a rare quality planet, but it's a pity, a war over 100 years ago completely destroyed Rage Owl Star." She was qualified to say so. She had been in this line of work for 150 years. She was 200 years old this year, yet still had the appearance of a middle-aged woman. She had already undergone 3 life extension surgeries and was about to go through her 4th. When she had just started her tax work, she had indeed seen the most flourishing stature of Rage Owl Star. She had also seen the worst state of Rage Owl Star and, in the last few decades, had personally ordered the execution of several governors on Rage Owl Star.